Hi, everybody. Radio Free Mormon here, broadcasting behind enemy lines. Tonight's episode 435, titled How to Believe in Mormonism. I am joined once more in the studio by my co-counsel, Kolby Reddish, on account of this is yet again another dissection of a chapter in Austin Fife, now famous because of us, Life on Truth Letter. How you doing, Mr. Kolby? How are you doing?
Good.
Whoa, Mr. Kolby in the studio. People are responding positively. It's so good to see you, my friend.
Good to see you.
I'm going to switch us over there on the sides there because I think that looks a little bit more balanced. As balanced as I can look. Hey, big surprise. You're wearing flannel.
Yeah. You got to give the people what they want, you know?
Indeed you do. And so we're going to talk again about Austin Fife's letter. Now, we've got a bit of a strange title. I came up with the title because I thought his was so bad. I came up with one that was just a little bit worse. His title for his chapter is Belief in God. And after talking about Mormonism, now he wants to go to God because I think that to give him his due, he wants to tell us about the experience he had with ceasing to believe in God for a week or two and then coming back to belief in God. And the amazing thing is, the reason I call it How to Believe in Mormonism is because it's not just about belief in God. It's how he abandoned Mormonism. And then Austin just used his common sense, the common sense that God gave him as a Mormon, to reconstruct religion and reconstruct the belief in God, which ends up really quite surprisingly being exactly like Mormonism.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's even that people are going to think it can't be that on the nose, but it is even that on the nose. Like that he even ends. I know we're going to cover the epilogue or conclusion chapter next week. But he literally ends it with the idea of ending exactly where he began.
What are the odds that a guy could figure out that Mormonism isn't true and then reconstruct his own belief system separate and completely distinct and apart from Mormonism and end up with Mormonism again?
Well, in Austin's case, pretty good.
Yeah, I think it was about 100% in his case.
That's right.
So this is Light on Truth Letter, chapter 20. We have numbered them. He did not. It's titled Belief in God. It's easier to say it's third from the end now than it's 20 chapters in. And that's not counting the introduction. So let's look at this, all right?
Can I do one correction from last week before we
Oh my
move
gosh,
into this week?
did you do something else up, Kolby? What happened?
No, it was just a weird turn of phrase. We were talking about the Lowry Nelson letter exchange, and I was talking about the situation in Cuba. And as I was talking about the difference between Cubans and the people in Utah, I unfortunately, when I was supposed to use the word Cuban, or I was trying to use the word Cuban, I actually said the word human. And so it just sounded very weird, like I was implying one of the groups was not human. And someone pointed that timestamp out to me. And it was just a slip of the tongue. I didn't mean it the way that I said it.
Wow. So. We have got a very bright audience. They will watch you closely.
Yeah, and actually, I super appreciate that. I know that sounds weird, that it's weird to get those types of corrections, but I actually really like knowing that we have an audience that sends us those corrections because they know that we'll talk about them. So
they're very, very sharp. Our audience is. And frankly, I agree with you. I appreciate the corrections as well. It would be a little bit hypocritical if we didn't invite such corrections when we are breaking down Austin Fife's Light on Truth letter, line by line and word by word, link by link and yard by yard. So here we go. Thank you for that correction, Kolby.
Of course.
Here's the title, Belief in God. He starts off as his wont with all of his chapters and quoting some unknown people on the internet. So can you read these couple of quotes from the internet?
I sure can. I love randos on the internet. They're my people. It says, I am an atheist after... So this is the quote that he pulled from Reddit. I am an atheist after leaving the church, and that road to atheism started on my mission. Tonight... And many nights before this, I have caught myself almost asking God for help. I've been out for almost 20 years, or for over 20 years, and the programming is still there. And that comes from a thread called I Wish There Was an Omnipotent God.
Okay. So somebody who wishes there were a God but doesn't believe that he's still there.
Mm-hmm.
And then a second quote, briefer, God knows where I am, and I've sent an open invitation to knock on my door. So far, nothing. No response. Wow. Okay. So he's got people up there who are not believing in God. These are the quotes, and that establishes the foundation to launch into his chapter about belief in God. And then he asked the question, Austin asked this question, as I wrap up this letter, thank God. Actually, that's the first evidence in this letter that there is a God, that he's wrapping it up finally. As I wrap up this letter, I end with a question that started my faith journey. Is there a God? I do think he's been rather consistent whenever he's talked about it, at least that I've heard, that his faith crisis had to do more with a belief in God and losing it than specifically about Mormonism. Is that your recollection?
Yeah, because if I remember correctly from the introduction, like one of the experiences that catalyzed his faith crisis was losing his father-in-law. And so, yeah, dealing with kind of typical problem of evil, problem of suffering kind of issues does tend to go more directly to just general theism concepts than it does specific to Mormonism.
Very good. Well, this is what he's going to talk about in this chapter. Can you read his first full paragraph in this chapter?
Sure can. During those first few months of my journey, I grappled with the problem of evil.
Okay. So now this is going to be one of the main things he's going to talk about is how he grappled successfully, apparently, with the problem of evil, at least successfully enough to get him to believe in God, who is still doing a bunch of evil everywhere he goes. But he's going to show us how he gets there. And that will be interesting. This is the problem of evil, folks. This is a problem that has bedeviled, if I may use that expression, believers in God, at least in God's goodness and omnipotence, all right? That he's good and he loves his children, and yet bad things happen to them, in spite of the fact that he's powerful enough to prevent bad things from happening to them. That's the problem of evil. This has been going on for thousands of years. The greatest minds in Western civilization, and I'm guessing Eastern civilization has probably dealt with this, but I don't know that for sure. But Western civilization, thousands of years, they've been grappling with this issue of how can God be great, by which I mean all powerful, and good, by which I mean all loving, and yet allow his children to suffer the way they suffer, as we know just by reading the evening news or watching the evening news. So what the greatest minds in Western civilization have struggled with for centuries and even millennia, Austin is going to resolve in a few pages.
Is he, though? No, yeah, this dates all the way back to Epicurus, basically. If God is all powerful and omniscient, right? And so it really is a problem.
If God is great, I'm sorry, it's sometimes phrased, if God is great, i.e., omnipotent. If God is great, he is not good. If God is good, he is not great. He can't be both.
Yeah, I was going to say it really is a problem for theological models of God that involve those omni properties: omnipotence, omnibenevolence, and omniscience.
Yes. So if God is not all powerful, then that explains why it is he can't prevent evil, though he would like to. And if God doesn't really love us as much as we think he does, and he doesn't really care about preventing evil happening to us, he can still be all powerful, just not all loving. You got to have a little give one way or the other, at least in some ways, to resolve it. Believe me, every way that's conceivable to man has been tried. And really what it is that, what's his name? Austin. What it is that Austin ends up trying to do here is really just throw at least 3 models in which the problem of evil can be solved, which he picked up along the way. And he's throwing them into his chapter and hoping that something will stick. In that way, it reminds me of the essay, the church's gospel topics essay on Abraham, where they give at least 3 different theories as to how it is that Joseph Smith could have still been a prophet, still translated the book of Abraham in some kind of divine means, and yet have it not match what is on the papyrus that was discovered in Egypt and later in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Now, we got through the first sentence here. Can you get through the rest? And I'm going to mute myself on purpose this time.
No, that's okay. It's a good introduction because this is a big theological problem. How can a loving God allow bad things to happen to good people? Why did my father-in-law pass away when his children were living at home and his wife desperately needed him? He was nothing but good. Did he deserve it? Did his family deserve it? Why does God help a rich American child find a lost toy after earnest prayer, while a child's prayer in a war-torn country goes unanswered? Why
I
does
know he
God
puts
allow...
that. I know he puts that line briefly. I did underline it with yellow, but it's as if he can't bring himself to actually steelman his own position.
Mm,
He is putting it in such vague terms. I'm not saying it has to be graphic, but let's state the problem a little more fully. Is what I think he should do. I think he's intentionally not stating the problem as starkly as he could, which gives him a little more leeway in resolving it in a less strenuous manner later in his chapter.
yeah, that's a really good point, because I think when you deal with the how do I say this, like the philosophical problem of evil, and you're able to keep things very abstract and vague, it's a lot easier to accept some of these explanations than when you do get into that level of detail. You and I have shared experience in our background as prosecutors. And when we were talking about prepping for this chapter, I don't know, 2 weeks ago on the phone, I had shared with you this story, and I'll just be very brief, but there was this story I worked on as a prosecutor where there was a young boy who was killed by his stepmother and father, basically in a neglect and abuse situation. Really, really heartbreaking story. And reviewing the file to get things ready for court, it was just something that, like, I truly feel like I will never forget that little boy and some of the images and videos that I saw. And that's more the detailed problem of evil. Like, when you start looking at the problem of evil from the perspective of someone whose life involved a level of suffering that you've never experienced, it becomes a completely different conception of the problem than just dealing with the philosophy in the abstract.
Yeah, and what we're dealing with in cases like that, and of course I'm aware of them as well, unfortunately, but with kids, they're usually kids because they're in the complete control of the parents, kids who get abused to death, and the abuse amounts to torture. So really what you have is children being tortured to death over a prolonged period by the people who are supposed to be taking care of them and protecting them.
Right. And then you have to grapple with the problem of seeing something like that, going to church on Sunday and hearing another kid roughly the same age getting up and talking about how much they know God is there for them and loves them because God helped them find their glasses or their lost toy. And that's not an example that I'm pulling out of thin air. Like, that is literally the problem that I was grappling with at the time I was a prosecutor working on this case. Is basically, it's not necessarily just the suffering. It's the suffering here plus the injustice of answering prayers that seem trivial by comparison on the opposite side of, the street, basically, is the problem that you then have to deal with.
Yeah. Well, I guess that helping a kid find his toy is a lot easier than saving a kid from abusive parents.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it really is easier. It's like, maybe this is one of the reasons Woody Allen, I think it was, said that the best thing you can say about God is he's an underachiever. Toys he can do, other things are too hard.
So true.
But that gets to the omnibenevolence. Terrible.
Probably.
Omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent. This gets to the omnipotent part of the argument that he's all powerful. You take it away from that. He's an underachiever, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so maybe he's not all powerful, or maybe he is, but he doesn't really do what he could do with his power. He's an underachiever. So once again, Woody Allen coming up with a way to explain the problem of evil in a humorous way, that God's an underachiever. But that's not usually the way believers in God would do it. Then there's couple more questions.
Yeah, let me finish these last two sentences. Sorry. Yes. Why does God allow vicious and brutal dictators to rule with an iron fist? What about the countless horrors enacted daily since the beginning of time?
What about them? Well, at least he talks about horrors enacted daily since the beginning of time. Well, he's going to tell us how it is that he solved the problem of evil and managed to come back to Mormonism as well. He writes further, though I knew all of the primary answers to my questions, my answers fell flat at this time. I remember feeling that a God who did nothing to help us was equivalent to no God at all. Okay, that's not exactly true. I mean, God who does nothing to help us is the equivalent of the deist God that many of the founding fathers believed in, mainly because I think of this problem of evil, that we could still have a God to explain creation, but in order to explain all the crap that happens to people down here on the earth, he's a guy who wound up the watch of the universe and then walked away, and he's getting a soda down on the corner. He'll be back sometime, but he's not around now, and that's why all this bad stuff is happening. He's probably out winding up other universes and other worlds is what he's doing. So really, I don't think that that's exactly correct, but this is how Austin felt. He felt that a God who did nothing to help us was equivalent to no God at all. And I think that's true as long as you believe that God is omnipotent and he loves us all so much, and he's very, very involved in interfering in the lives of people in order to bring about just results and good results. He says, then something happened in a completely unrelated setting. I heard a phrase that would change my life forever. And that phrase is this: death is not the worst thing that can happen to us. And I put a note below. Those notes below, those are mine to remind me of what it was that occurred to me when I was going through these slides originally. And my comment was, not if your life is so miserable as to make dying preferable. You see, he says death is not the worst thing that can happen to us, which has an immense impact on him. But of course, it's true, death is not the worst thing that can happen to us if your life is so miserable as to make dying preferable. Okay? I don't know that this is the way he means it. He's less than pellucid in his writing. But death is not the worst thing that can happen to us as long as God has made life so miserable and not saved us from the misery of life, that we live in a life that is so miserable that we would rather die than continue living. Your thoughts?
My biggest thought is this is one area where, different models of God have different advantages and disadvantages. And I think one of the advantages of Mormonism's version of God is that God is literally like our Father. We have this parent-child relationship to him. That's a great pitch. It's a great conception of God when you need that comfort and you want a deity that's like closer and more accessible to you. But with that comes certain problems. And I think you can see that problem in the last sentence of this first paragraph here, where he says, I remember feeling that a God who did nothing to help us was equivalent to no God at all. That's because if you were raised like Austin was, or like I was, to believe in the Mormon version of God, you do believe that God treats us like a child, or as a parent. You believe that God treats us like a parent treats their child. And that is one of the things that makes the problem of evil much tougher, a much tougher pill to swallow. There are versions even of Christianity that have a much less accessible or less personal version of God, in the sense that God is like a completely different type of entity. He's something that we cannot understand. In fact, I think the further you go back in the Old Testament, this is the model of God you see most often, I think, in the Old Testament, right? When Job is asking, like, why would you do this? Why would you allow this suffering to happen in my life? God's response is basically a whole chapter of, were you there when the pillars of the earth were formed? And so my point is just
chapters and chapters of, who do you think you are to talk to me like that?
Exactly. And same thing with Moses. Same thing with Moses, right? When Moses says, I'm slow of speech, and God says, I'm the one who formed man's mouth. Are you the one who formed man's mouth? All to say that it's very interesting from the perspective I have today to see how these different philosophical models of God lead to certain advantages and certain disadvantages. And so a predictable problem I see with Mormonism, or one downside I see of Mormonism's version of God, I mean, is that it gets a lot harder to justify the problem of evil when you really do believe that the model of God is that parent-to-child relationship.
The Mormon version.
Yeah, the Mormon version. And the one last thing I'll say about this,
it is like Jesus says in the New Testament: if a man asks his father for bread, will he give him a serpent?
And that's what I was going to say. I was going to say for Christians that, and I was going to use that exact example. So good mind reading ability there, RFM. For Christians that would say, that model of this is why Mormonism is false, because it leads people to believe in this false version of God. That comparison was good enough for Jesus in the New Testament. That's in the Sermon on the Mount. So if it was good enough for Jesus, it feels like it's pretty fair to call it at least within the realm of acceptable Christian models of who God is.
Oh, absolutely. Pray unto your Father who is in heaven. In many of the parables, he likens God to a father with sons. Not exclusively, of course.
Right.
All right. So are we ready to go on?
The one last thing I was going to say, because I know you're going to talk more about this phrase here at the bottom, is this idea that death is not the worst thing that can happen to us. The way Austin has this in his chapter, because it is basically what led him to basically being willing to believe in God again, and then leads him back to belief in God, or choosing to believe in God. It's a little confusing. We'll get there. That phrase is something, and I was even talking to my wife about this. This phrase is something that I would agree with too. You and I talked about it on the phone. We would both agree with. So it's a little confusing to have something that to me seems almost like trivially true to lead Austin back to a conclusion that I don't accept. I don't really know very many atheists that would disagree with the notion that there are things that can happen to you that are worse than death. That just seems like almost anyone would agree with that.
Loss of honor, loss of dignity, loss of close personal relationship.
Right.
Especially if you could save and did not save. There's all sorts of ways that you can think of that death is not the worst thing that can happen to us. But I think that this is not what Austin's talking about, because that has nothing to do with leading you to believe in God, just your own personal conduct in life. I think what he's saying is death is not the worst thing that can happen to us, because, there's some pretty scary shit that can happen to you, and it's going to happen to you after death unless you start believing in Mormonism, which is why he went back to Mormonism. And that's why it reminded me of this very famous part of Hamlet's most famous soliloquy. Who would fardels bear? Believe me, those are heavy, those fardels. They're not fun to bear. Okay? That's the point. Who would fardels bear? To grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns, puzzles the will, and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. I think this is what he's talking about when he says death is not the worst thing that can happen to you, because there's bad stuff on the other side that could happen to you too. Mm-hmm. What do you think?
Yeah, I can see that. Basically, the idea of the suffering / evil that I know is preferable to the potential evil and suffering that I don't know. That's the way I read this passage from Hamlet. But
this is why we stay alive.
Yeah.
This is why we stay alive, okay? Because we've got this instinct for survival and this instinct to struggle against death, so much so that we will continue to live in a really, really crappy, miserable situation that's preferable to us, rather than the fear of what happens after death. We don't know it, but we fear it. And I think that Austin is suggesting more than just fear. He's suggesting knowledge that things can be worse for us after death than death itself. Now, if we got this wrong, Austin, remember there's an invitation open to you to come on the show and explain what it is you mean if we're getting this wrong. We're trying our best to understand what it is you're writing. If we're getting it wrong, please come on the show and tell us how we got it wrong and how we can better understand your argument. Oh, here's something from Christopher Hitchens.
Yeah, I included this because when I saw Austin's the phrase that really resonated with him, it made me think about this phrase from Christopher Hitchens. He gave this in one of his speeches towards the tail end of his life. So for people who don't know, he died in 2012, and he was on the lecture circuit talking about his ideas and why he had rejected religion, like right up until the time he died of cancer. And I just think this turn of phrase is really funny, and it actually makes me think of what I think would be a fate worse than death. So Hitchens said, it will happen to all of us that at some point you'll get tapped on the shoulder and told, not just that the party's over, but that it's slightly worse, that the party's going on, but you have to leave, and it's going on without you. That's the reflection that I think most upsets people about their demise. All right, then, because it might make us feel better, let's pretend the opposite. Instead, you'll get tapped on the shoulder and told, great news, this party's going on forever. And you can't leave. You've got to stay. The boss says so, and he also insists that you have a good time.
Yes, the eternal party.
The eternal party where you're forced to subjugate your will for all of eternity, I guess, to me, is a fate worse than death. And I know that Hitch
Keep
has
that
looked
smile
at it.
on your face.
That's right. And I know that Hitch looked at it the same way. So
That's a great quote and a very interesting perspective. Austin goes on. This innocuous phrase, given by someone who did not know my internal struggle, the one about death is not the worst thing that can happen to you, single-handedly opened the window to belief again in my agnostic heart. Wow, that's a powerful thing. Sometimes you hear an expression, it can have a powerful influence on you. Apparently, this is what happened to Austin. I realized that I was treating this life as the end of all existence. So I think I'm correct in understanding what he means. I realized that I was treating this life as the end of all existence. So he's pointing to something after. See, I'm not sure how long I had internalized atheism.
neither are we.
It could have been a few minutes, I'm not sure. But it had been there for some time. With that atheistic mindset, if this life is all there is, see, yes, I am right. That's why I underlined it. If this life is all there is, then truly any amount of suffering and wrong is unjust. I'm not sure how it's made less unjust by not making this life all that there is, but he seems convinced that that's the case. He goes on. If there is a loving God, by the way, feel free to interrupt anytime you got an idea there, Kolby, okay?
Mm-hmm.
If there is a loving God, but there is so much evil in the world, then it follows that he likely gives us space to make our own choices. Now, notice this, please. You're going to see a really, really amazingly long list of sentences that begin with the word if. And I didn't, excuse me, that's a prop for a different show. That's for Mormonism After Dark. It was just lying here because we did that show last night. We've got one if there, okay? If there is a loving God, but there's so much evil in the world, then it follows that he likely gives us space to make our own choices. That is quite a logical jump. And yet Mormonism allows him to make it without even realizing that he's making it in favor of Mormonism, I think. Even if, oh, look, there's another one. Even if our choices harm others. If not, there's another if. The malevolent dictators would never take power and rapists would not exist. People would not neglect or harm one another. So the comment I had made below is, with this atheistic mindset, if this life is all there is, then truly any amount of suffering is wrong and unjust. That's a quote from what he said, I think. Austin can't even bring himself to state the corollary fully. All right? And the corollary, to state it fully in opposition to what he just said, was if this life is not the end of our story, then any amount of suffering and wrong is just. Okay? That's the opposite. That's the flip side of the coin. Instead, all he can say is, what is it he says? With this atheistic mindset, I've got to find that again. If this life is all there is, then truly any amount of suffering and wrong is unjust. On the other hand, if this life is not the end of our story, then there has to be more to the story. That's what I mean, is he can't even bring himself to state the opposite side of the corollary. He says, then there has to be more to the story, instead of saying the correct thing that he should say. Then any amount of suffering and wrong is just.
Right.
But he realizes that is a tough nut to crack. So he makes it easier for him to crack by not stating it fully. That's my point.
Yeah, it's also funny how he, right after that line you've been talking about, and I'm going to analyze it, I think, on the next slide, but right before that, or I'm sorry, right after that, he says, on the other hand, okay, let me just read this out. If this life is not the end of our story, then there has to be more to the story. Well, yeah, that sentence is just tautological. If you accept that there's more to the story, yes, there is more to the story. Like, it's just funny how often he says stuff like this. Yeah.
It highlights how unwilling he is to state the other side of the proposition.
Yeah. I wanted to look, I think if you'll go to the next slide, I actually wanted to break down that. Oh. I forgot that I created this. So we had done an image of Austin trying to pitch his Light and Truth letter, and I think I did it in the on Sesame Street. So I decided to add this this segment here at the bottom. I'm calling it Austin's Fallacy Hour, because I'm going to accept what Austin said on that last slide and just talk about how structurally, logically, walking through his reasoning just shows how much of a problem it is. So that's why I'm dubbing this little segment here Austin's Fallacy Hour.
And the fallacy is spelled with an F, not a PH. Moving on.
So here's that line that we had pulled from him. And it's not very often that people actually put their arguments basically in if then format, but he did us a lot of favor by doing that, because then we can put it into a syllogism. So Austin said, with this atheistic mindset, you can throw that part out. If this life is all that there is, then truly any amount of suffering is unjust. So the P1 that's kind of unstated here, the first premise, the major premise is, if there is no afterlife, then this life is all that exists. That's just the flip side of that tautology that I read from him, right? He then says, if this life is all that exists, then any amount of suffering is wrong and unjust. Therefore, if there is no afterlife, any amount of suffering is wrong and unjust. Now, notice what hasn't been argued for. So the kind of the catch-all term for any informal logical fallacy is a non sequitur. It's that the conclusion doesn't fall from the premises, right? Yes. And while we have a conclusion here of what Austin actually argued, the conclusion that he then wants you to accept is, therefore, an afterlife exists. Therefore, we have good reason to believe in an afterlife, right? But he hasn't argued.
God is shitting all over us in this life, so there must be an afterlife.
You know, he maketh it to fall on the just and the unjust, I believe.
Yes.
RFM is what he says.
It's in Ecclesiastes. God maketh the shit to fall on the just and on the unjust.
That's right. So just notice what Austin hasn't actually argued for at all at this point, which is that the afterlife actually exists. Instead, Austin just can't accept the possibility that there cannot be an afterlife because it would be unfair.
I think it would be I think it's a conclusion he's not willing to confront.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like the idea that maybe the church isn't true, because I still don't think he's ever actually asked himself that question.
Right.
Okay, what hasn't been argued? Good point. This is called also begging the question, right? He's assuming something in a premise. In a premise, you're not supposed to assume something. Mm-hmm. Your premises are supposed to be demonstrable, ironclad. Otherwise, you cannot have confidence in the correctness of the conclusion that's based upon the two premises.
Right.
Okay. And begging the question, once again, simply means that he is avoiding the question of whether there's an afterlife at all, I think. And yet he's trying to assume it into existence.
Yeah, I think the other clear fallacy that he uses here is the argument from consequences. So we talked about this one a number of times throughout his chapters.
You know, he's going to be complaining about the violence in this Play-Doh Sesame Street imagery of yours. And this is why he won't come on the show, because you make freaking things like this and we put him up on the screen and he gets scared.
Well, this one actually was an analogy. I'm going to use this as my analogy, but it doesn't have anything to do with Austin. I was going to use it as applied to me, but Austin's going to whine about whatever Austin's going to whine about. So I just don't care. So let me demonstrate why not only is it begging the question, like you said, but it also is an argument from consequences, because here's kind of the unstated part. So we talked about this. If there is no afterlife, then any amount of suffering is wrong and unjust. That's the premise that flows from what he was talking about earlier. That result is morally unacceptable to me. Therefore, there must be an afterlife. That's really the thought process that's going on here.
Yes.
And I wanted to talk about
the conclusion is driving everything.
Exactly. And the reason that this is an argument from consequences is we could use the exact same structure of an argument here for my house getting invaded by armed men and say, if armed men are invading my house, then that's going to be wrong and is going to be unfair. That result is not what I would like to be true. Therefore, there cannot be armed men invading my house at this moment. This is one of the reasons that arguments from consequences are a real problem for when people want to base their worldview on it, is you're not guarding yourself against potential wishful thinking, because the truth of the proposition has nothing to do with how desirable or undesirable the consequences are. And then
So if I'm understanding you, and I think I am now, the consequence that he's avoiding is whether there is no life after death.
Correct.
So that is so difficult for him to contemplate. that he will construct a syllogism based upon the idea that it does exist and it must exist.
Right. So if we were to flip that around to my analogy that I illustrated here, right? Cammy and I put the kids down for the night. We're laying in bed. I hear a noise. Of course, based on where I live, it's very, very rare that it could be people invading my house, right? But let's say that for the purposes of this analogy, it is. If my thought is that result would be so undesirable to me, or that would be so problematic for me, that would really affect my life, that would make me really sad if someone's coming into my home to hurt my family, this helps demonstrate exactly why an argument from consequences can be such a dangerous poison to your critical thinking faculties, is because we're not guarding ourselves against what we want to believe. Instead, we're leaning into that. That would be me saying, that can't be people invading my house because that would be so undesirable to me. Now, that
Right.
would be the same as me saying, that probably isn't people invading my house because it's very unlikely people would be invading my house, right? The structure of these thought patterns very much matters. And that's where I just come to kind of my conclusion on the way Austin phrased all of this, which is that I just refuse to believe in a model of God that would have me accept God's existence based solely on fallacious arguments. And what I mean by that is, so often when it comes down to these theistic arguments, they are fallacious. They are just full circular reasoning, or they're a clear textbook example of one of these informal logical fallacies. And I just refuse to believe that God would want me to accept his existence based on the type of epistemology that would lead me to be taken advantage of by every huckster, every fraudster, and every con man if I were to apply that universally throughout my entire life for the biggest questions, which involve, is there an afterlife? Does he want to reach out to me? I just am unwilling to accept that.
There's something you'd mentioned to me on the phone yesterday when we were talking about this show, was that at least, okay, backing up a second, if there's an afterlife, generally considered to be a good proposition, depending on if you end up on the right hand of God. Not having an afterlife, generally considered to be a bad proposition, though not universally so, okay? But what you had suggested to me was that at least you could say that your process, your thinking process, leads you to a conclusion that you wouldn't be inclined to want to accept as correct.
Right.
In other words, you're not believing what you want to believe, which is always a bias that you have to guard against when you come to reasoning into that position.
Yep, absolutely. I know it's been a while since I shared this quote, but there's this quote from Carl Sagan in his daughter Sasha Sagan's book that she basically opens it with saying, it is dangerous to believe things just because you wish them to be true. And that's exactly what we're talking about here, is you can have a lot more confidence in a proposition you've reached that you do not want to be true. To use an example, if I'm working on a case as a lawyer at work and I'm doing research and I find a case that's really problematic for my case.
Mm-hmm. Do you ignore it and hope nobody else finds it?
No, you definitely don't ignore it. But I can usually be a lot more confident because of the way our cognitive biases work, that if I'm reading a case and I think it's bad for my case, it's probably really is bad for my case, than the inverse. Where if I read a case and I'm like convinced, oh, this helps show that I'm absolutely right, I at least have to be cognizant of the possibility that I'm implying that into that case I'm reading because of my bias.
Yes. And the more interpretation you have to do in order to support your side, usually the wronger you are. Usually it's right on its face. Okay. By the way, I did want to say a couple things. First off was that when I had made that comment, it may have sounded super snarky about Austin wetting himself when he sees a picture like this that you've made and not come on the show because of it. I'm not making that up. That's what he said when he saw the thumbnail that I had made for a previous episode. It was Testimony Gunfight, you and me with cowboy hats and 6-shooters, and him hiding behind his Light on Truth letter with some bullet holes in it, which I thought was really, really clever. But he used that as an excuse to hide his shame and chicken shittedness about coming on the show and said, well, I'm not going to come on the show. Look, they're violent. They're violent. What could they do to me? They might do something horribly violent to me if I came on their show. Even though he's hundreds of miles away from each other.
Rest assured that if we did, it would be felt puppet and claymation versions only, Austin. These are just examples of helping illustrate. In fact, the point of that testimony gunfight, the reason that you had used that is because we were dealing with the special pleading problem of spiritual witnesses, and that was the entire point. Is like a gun, like the shootout at the OK Corral. It's just a funny concept to think about the special pleading problem between people who accept the validity of spiritual witnesses.
Yes, they were just shooting spiritual bullets. It's okay, Austin. The other thing I want to say to anybody who's watching this is, at least for me, I am not saying in this episode that there is no God, okay? All I'm doing is I'm saying one of the perpetual problems about the existence of God, who is all powerful and all good, is the problem of evil, and that I don't think Austin has adequately resolved that issue, at least not to my satisfaction. Maybe there's an explanation out there. I tend to think that if God exists, he's a very different kind of God than a lot of Christians think that he or she or it is. I think that it is someone who is not all good and maybe not all powerful. I think that is, if God exists, I think that people have really burdened God with a lot of high expectations.
I would also say for my part that I'm also not trying to establish that God does not exist in this episode. Depending on the definition of people use for God in those types of conversations, I've even said that I'm willing to concede based on the evidence that deism, or this idea of like Spinoza's God, Einstein's God, the way they saw God, depending on how we, work through those nuances, I've said before that I'm willing to concede that I likely could accept that label as applied to myself. So that's also kind of where I'm coming from. Really,
it is these two aspects of God that are so important to people, that he's all powerful and all good. Because if you give on either of those, then you can resolve the problem of evil.
Right.
But the fact that people have been arguing about the problem of evil for thousands of years indicates the fact that a lot of Christians and believers in God are not willing to compromise on either of those ideas, that he is all powerful and he is all loving and all good.
Well, and one of the reasons they're often not willing to make that concession, to be fair, is because the second you do, then the natural next question is, and why should I believe or worship a being that is neither all powerful nor all good, or either or between those two? So
yeah. Okay. Good point. The next slide, going back to Austin's letter, can you read this? Because now, go ahead and read this. We'll talk about it. He's going to quote a story in Alma chapter 14:11 that we're all familiar with. And it's about Alma and Amulek and one of their adventures together, watching women and children burned alive. And these are faithful women and children. These are Mormon women and children being burned alive. So you would think that they would have some compassion for them. And yet, even though Alma has the power, he's got that priesthood power to save him. And even though Amulek asks him to use his power to save these people, Alma says, no, I'm not going to do that. Wouldn't be prudent to save these people from being burned alive. And here's why. And I'll turn it over to you to read this.
In Alma 14, Alma and Amulek witnessed the death by fire of faithful women and children at the hands of bad people. Amulek begs Alma to use God's power to deliver the faithful and innocent women and children from death. But Alma said unto him, The Spirit constraineth me, that I must not stretch forth mine hand. For behold, the Lord receiveth them up unto himself in glory.
Remember, it was the Spirit that constrained Nephi to kill Laban?
I was having the same exact thought. This is the
no way
problem. Yeah. The
weird, because the Spirit constrains Nephi to kill Laban, but the same Spirit apparently constrains Alma to let all these people die.
Yeah. He's either pro or anti-murder, depending on the day. Behold, the Lord receiveth them up unto himself in glory.
He's pro-murder in both instances.
That's true. He is pro-murder in both instances.
God is consistent in the Book of Mormon. You'll be happy to know.
Same yesterday, today, and forever. Okay.
He's in favor of murder yesterday, today, and forever.
Behold, the Lord receiveth them up unto himself in glory, and he doth suffer that they may do this thing, or that the people may do this thing unto them, according to the hardness of their hearts, that the judgment which he shall exercise upon them in his wrath may be just, and the blood of the innocent shall stand as a witness against them, yea, and cry mightily against them at the last day. Before we get into the details of this, I just have to observe that the types of phrases we see in the Book of Mormon, and he does suffer that they may do this thing, or that the people may do this thing unto them. This is supposed to be, because it's in Alma, right? Something that was abridged by Mormon and Moroni. Keeping both of those phrases in there as an abridgment makes absolutely no sense. You would correct those types of what that is very consistent with is someone who is orally dictating a text and correcting and adding additional detail as they're dictating stream of consciousness. That is that type of language where you're immediately correcting and adding additional detail to a phrase you've already said is very hard to believe in the Book of Mormon's correlated narrative, what it says about itself, meaning that Mormon and Moroni are reading whatever records they're reading and then abridging those things onto a separate set of plates.
Can you tell me exactly what it is you mean in this passage?
And he doth suffer that they may do this thing, or that the people may do this thing unto them.
Okay, so second line down, and he doth suffer that they may do this thing, or that the people may do this thing unto them.
Yeah.
Because first off, he says it incorrectly, because the they refers to the people who are getting burned to death.
Right.
At least according to the way the sentence is structured, right?
Right.
The Lord receiveth them, the dying people, up unto himself in glory, and he doth suffer that they may do this thing. Oops. It sounds like I'm talking about the people who are dead. So let's recast this. Or that the people may do this thing unto them.
Right.
According to the hardness of their hearts.
Right.
I see what you're talking about now.
Right.
Good point. I had said, first off, this is a different method of trying to solve the problem of evil. That's one thing I want to note. This is not about, it's a lot of suffering for some people in a really little period of time. In other words, trying to minimize it by comparing this earth life to eternity. So you minimize it out of existence and you smooth that rough spot down by making it eternal. That's one way, and that's a separate and distinct way of trying to solve the problem of evil from what is stated here. And you looked this up last night on your phone. It actually has a name for it, doesn't it? This argument.
Yeah, I'll go into that a little bit in a few slides, I think.
Oh, okay. Well, I always thought this was such a lame excuse. I always did. From the first time I read it in the Book of Mormon. I get to this point in the story, and Amulek wants Alma to exercise his power to save these people. I'm going, yeah, go, Alma. Save the people with your power. But he says, not going to do it because, of this reason. And it always sounded like he was making excuses, that he didn't really have the power after all. And he's just trying to make an excuse for why it is he's not exercising it. Although that would almost require a real Alma and Amulek for that to happen. But it was a very disappointing story. And it never made sense to me. I will say it. It never made sense to me that God actually has to allow murderers to kill people before he can judge them for being a murderer. Because what about all the scriptures and all the times we've been taught in Mormon classes that God will judge us according to the desires of our hearts? If we want to do something good, but we're not able to do it for whatever reason, he will judge us for that desire. If we want to do something bad, but we can't do it for whatever reason, he will judge us according to that bad desire. So that makes me think, why is it that he couldn't intervene, save the people, and still judge these people who were trying to murder them justly?
There is no answer to that. Yeah.
I don't know. And if there's some kind of rule that he can't, at least in this story, it's just strange that he would rather allow these people to die a horrible death than to get his digs in at these people who are killing him fully and completely. Because he's got to wait and let them. I mean, the God of Mormonism is in so many respects not all powerful. Okay, so here's the irony. This describes a God who's not all powerful. He cannot save his people and judge the people who are murdering them in the process adequately unless they completely murder them. Only then can he really judge them completely, justly, send them to hell, according to the Book of Mormon. All right? So the very story itself necessitates a God who is not all powerful. An all-powerful God could do both. Okay.
And just so people can understand, because there is a model of this story where you could say, well, God is allowing this to happen because he has some greater good plan ultimately that will manifest out of that suffering or out of that evil. That's not what RFM is talking about here. RFM is talking about this model of God that requires the blood of the innocents to stand as a witness against them, against the wicked people, before God is able to judge them adequately. That's the part that imposes the limitation on at least this version of God's power.
So, in order to solve the problem of evil, which necessitates the idea that God is all powerful and all loving, right? That's what we're trying to save, is that God. He goes to a model that has a God that is not all powerful in it.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Okay. I just never thought this was a great story. It was always one of those stories I get to in the Book of Mormon. I know it's coming by the third time I've read it, and I've read a lot more since then. And it's just always, I just don't like it that much because it doesn't make sense to me. Why doesn't the person who has the power to save people who are being burned alive use it, Alma? That's what I want to know.
Well, yeah, because there are flip sides of these promises that are made to faithful people in the Book of Mormon itself. Mosiah chapter 2, 41 says that God blesses those who obey his commandments in all things, both temporal and spiritual, until they are received, into his everlasting grace or whatever, however that verse ends. But it makes a very clear, conditional promise that you're blessed in all things, temporal and spiritual, if you keep God's commandments. And again, as you said, these women and children who are being burned are the faithful people in this narrative. And to the concern about God's power, it's later in the same exact chapter in Alma 14 when Alma and Amulek tumble the entire prison, as with the sound of thunder, and walk out of it completely safe. And so this just, again, comes back to these inconsistency problems in the model of God when you're dealing with the problem of evil. It's awful convenient, I guess I would say, for Alma and Amulek to be worthy, or not just worthy, but deserving and able to receive God's power in this instance, but for some reason that we don't understand. And because God, I guess, needed their blood to be spilled before he could judge these wicked people, he needs the women and children to die. It's just very difficult to believe this model of God.
It is, and I don't mean to be offensive to anybody who's watching, but I'll take a gamble and say it a little bit more strongly, okay? Christians who are trying to solve the problem of evil and maintain God as an omnipotent being are also dealing with a God, by and large, who's not omnipotent in the first place because he cannot forgive you for your sins, Kolby, without killing his own son.
Or himself, depending on your theology.
Yeah. Yeah, he just can't forgive you. Like I did last week when you did that terrible thing to me, remember? And I freely and frankly forgave you. Mm-hmm. See, I can do that without killing somebody. And that means that I have a power that God does not have. And something's wrong with that, I think.
It's one of the things that's very weird about the Mormon version of God, again, though, that does distinguish it from more conventional Christianity, is Mormons then have a theological solution to that to say, well, actually, God is subject to the same laws that we are. But again, then he's not all powerful, even though the Book of Mormon literally refers to him as the Lord omnipotent. Think about that for a second.
Yeah, he's subject to a law that says gods have to kill their sons before they can forgive people. But the regular people down here on the earth, right, don't have to kill anybody to forgive.
Yeah.
In fact, we're commanded to. We're commanded to forgive others and commanded not to kill people. So we're in a double bind.
Yeah, it's not a very convincing theological out. I'm just saying that they do use it to say, well, God is subject to these laws. They can basically put, when you don't believe that God is the ultimate top of the pyramid as far as where the commands come from, that God can also be subject to commands, you can offload some of those burdens onto the laws themselves. Whether that's convincing or not is a completely separate question, but it at least internally allows you to escape from some of these problems.
Especially when in Mormonism, God from time to time seems to untether himself from those eternal laws and tell people that they need to violate those laws for some unspoken mysterious greater good, which
Yeah.
usually has to do with bedding teenagers.
So now that we've pissed off every Mormon and every Christian that may be listening to us, shall we continue with the light?
I think we better. We're going to be here all day pissing people off. This is your slide?
This is the analysis that we were talking about on the phone. So Austin's first answer to the question of why, I also just have to observe this. So Austin's first answer after talking about, here's why I'm not sure I believe in God, is a pointed rhetorical scriptural story. Because make no mistake, that's what we've got in Alma chapter 14, right? It is making theological points. Simply believing the book's claims presupposes the very thing that he's told you he's questioning or had rejected, that God exists. And what I mean by that is, if you're taking scripture at face value and believing it, then you obviously, maybe without even realizing it, believe or are accepting the proposition that a God exists and speaks to us through scripture. Unless that scripture you somehow believe is historical, then you're just engaged in a logical circle. So this passage, one of the things I looked at that we were talking about on the phone is this passage is primarily post-Christian ideas, inconsistent with the people who grew out of nothing more than the first 5 books of Moses through Isaiah, as is recorded in the brass plates. So the
this
three
talks
things
about punishment and penalties and damnation, doesn't it? Let me just check this out just once more.
Yeah.
Blood of the innocent shall stand as a witness against them that cry mightily against them at the last day. It does sound very New Testament, but where is that in the Old Testament?
It's really not there. So what we have here are 3 presuppositions in this passage that come out of the New Testament more than they do the Old Testament. The idea of a final judgment with individual moral reviews, an afterlife with individual rewards, and this concern that God's punishments must be fair. That, I would say, is not even just a post-Christian idea. That's more a post-Enlightenment idea. And what do you know? It just so happened to hit the scene in 1830. If you'll go to the next slide, I actually have some scriptures that help make this idea.
Good, because I do want to ask you about whether you think that Job in the Old Testament and Ecclesiastes are also concerned with the idea about God's punishments being fair.
Perfect.
All right.
So this idea that our final judgment is going to have individual moral review, I'm not going to read all of these in their entirety, but this idea is replete through the New Testament. So whether it's in Matthew, where Christ says, "For by thy words thou shalt be justified, and by thy words thou shalt be condemned," or in Romans, where Paul writes, "Every tongue shall confess to God, so then every one of us shall give account of himself to God," or in the idea of Revelation, which has the judgment bar, and the dead were judged out of those things which were written in the books according to their works. It's really hard to look at what's written in Alma here and not see it as drawing theologically on these ideas. There's really no equivalent of these same ideas in the Old Testament. There's maybe something in the book of Daniel when I was looking last night that's a lot vaguer, a lot less specific than this. But this idea that we are being judged and or justified, and that there's this like grand accounting of our individual moral acts, really is a post-Christianity New Testament idea. On the second one, if you'll move to the next slide.
So in the Book of Mormon, where in the timeline is this story about Alma and Amulek?
82 and 81 BC. So we're dealing I guess late Second Temple period.
Well, we're before Jesus comes, at least in the New World or the Old World. We're both actually.
Right. So that second presupposition, this idea that we've got an afterlife with individual rewards, the clearest example to me was John 14:2, "In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you." And then below, I've got a snippet from the Wikipedia page on Sheol, the Hebrew belief basically in what the afterlife looked like, which was completely different than this New Testament idea that you're going to have this resurrected body that will, enjoy some type of companionship with God. You can see it here. It says, in some texts, Sheol is considered the home of both the righteous and the wicked, sometimes separated into respective compartments. In others, it was considered a place of punishment meant for the wicked dead alone. This idea is so different than the post-Christian idea of what the afterlife looks like, that it's more akin to like the Greek belief in Hades or the Greek underworld, where it was
Mhm.
kind of this
Shadows
weird,
and shades,
yeah,
walking
shadow
about and
realm.
mingling and not really being able to have parties.
That's exactly right. Then on the third presupposition, I didn't come up with any specific examples, but you wanted to talk more about how it compares to Job. Let me maybe explain why I see it different than Job, because Job does have the passage we've already talked about. I think it starts in like 48.
For the audience, Job is based around the idea of bad things happening to good people, and why is this and why is it fair? It doesn't resolve it other than for God to say, sit down and shut up, Job. I'm God. You're nobody, okay? So just deal with it. And I believe that is the message of Job. It's not what you hear in Sunday school very often.
Yeah, it is explicitly the message of Job. I guess the way I would look at it differently post Enlightenment is I think there are better attempts post Enlightenment to try and explain why God's judgment is just, when the Old Testament, whether it's that passage in Exodus we already talked about or Job, the answer is not really God's judgments are just. It's more, who are you to question God? That to me, I
Yes.
think, is a slightly different lens of. Now, they both result in how dare you question me, but to me it feels like the New Testament, and especially post Enlightenment Christian ideals, are more about explaining why God's judgments are actually good versus just saying you are of no character or caliber to question my behavior or authority.
Yes. And it's interesting that the verse that we heard and we used very much in the church, we don't use it so much anymore. Is it Job 38? Where wast thou when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? And we use that to talk about the premortal existence, right? When actually it has nothing to do with that. He's not
Right.
saying you were there. He's saying you weren't there. And
Right.
I was, so shut the F up, okay?
Right.
Because you got no standing here. Where were you when I created, the Pleiades or the horse, this incredible, magnificent creature of war and strength? I'm the one who created him, not you, pal. Okay. Okay.
Right.
So the next one. Oh, by the way, I did want to say this, and I don't want to forget. Is this fair? Within the context of Austin saying that he left the church, he left his belief in God, even if it was only in his mind. He left his belief in God, but then he worked his way back to it independently of Mormonism, and he came back to Mormonism by reasoning his way back into it. And I just wonder if it's fair to use a passage from the Book of Mormon to support that journey.
It's entirely circular, right?
Yeah.
That's
It
kind
seems
of exactly, yeah, that's kind of exactly the point I was making by going through all of that, is that you can't just fall back on your questions about Mormonism by relying on stuff from Mormonism. I mean, you can. It's just you're engaged entirely in one logical circle. You only have that one epistemic touch point, and he doesn't seem to realize that.
And it seems to be contrary to his entire narrative in this chapter. So he goes on here. Do you want to read this, or I'm sorry?
Can I say one more thing about Job before we move on to this slide, which is a few slides ago, you had that example of the corollary of what Austin's argument was, which is if there is an afterlife, then any amount of suffering can be just.
Yes.
Yeah. If this life is not the end of our story, then any amount of suffering and wrong is just. And I just would be remiss if I didn't mention, while we're talking about Job, for people who remember the details of that story, Job loses his friends, he loses his family, he loses children, he loses all of his animals, all of
Everything.
this.
And then he gets all sick and has boils, and it's just nasty.
And all of this starts because of this conversation between supposedly Yahweh and Satan. And they basically have this bet over whether Job will continue to praise God for even if God is not as favorable to Job. That's the whole theological point of this story. This is the reason a lot of people believe it's not an actual story, right? That it's a rhetorical invention.
Because the real God and the real Satan would never engage in such a wager.
That's right. They play poker. They don't bet like that. But
it's Penny Annie.
One of the things that's really interesting about the end of that story that hit me even when I was a believer is that the way the story ends is Job basically regains his losses, including lost children. So and by regains lost children, I mean he has more children.
Mm-hmm.
When I
he gets
think
more
about
of everything at the end, and that is his reward for staying true to God in spite of just not getting blessed at all and getting cursed at every step.
Right. And when I think about what's on offer here, it's very similar to what you had written here, the corollary that Austin doesn't want to talk about, which is if this life is not the end of our story, then any amount of suffering and wrong is just. It's the story of Job basically makes the same point in a way that when I really stopped and thought about those individual relationships is just a model of God I also cannot accept. This idea that if I were to lose one of my children, God can somehow make it up to me by giving me a new child.
Mm-hmm.
That for those in the crowd who have children, you know that that's not the way that those individual relationships work. There is nothing that can replace that relationship with that individual consciousness of your children. I have 3, and every single one of them is different and unique and funny and weird and annoying sometimes and makes me laugh and has their own little weird quirks. So this idea that we would look at replacing children the same way we would replacing the camels and cattle and sheep that Job lost is one of the first times as I was grappling with the Old Testament that I recognized I am not sure that I even buy the premise of what's on offer here, which is exactly what you have outlined here, that God can apparently do what or allow to be done to us, whatever. And as long as he somehow repays it in the end, it's all good.
Yes.
I'm not sure I would ever buy that as applied to losing these family relationships is the last thing I just would say.
So you got 3 kids, you love them dearly, God takes them from you or allows Satan to, however you want to read the story, but they're gone, okay? They die. And then God gives you 10 children after putting you through hell. And now you're supposed to be totally at peace because you've got more children than you had before, and you're not going to be for the rest of your life mourning the loss of the original 3.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the premise of the ending of Job.
Good point. And I tend to agree with those commentators who think that the first part and the last part, the framing of it is a later addition to the original story in order to make it. In order to answer the question that the original story of Job raises, but answers in a very different way.
Interesting.
And here we go. We're moving forward. I think we're here to the next part in this letter. Can you read this paragraph?
Happy to.
Austin?
I did not believe all at once, but for the first time in a while, belief in God made sense. If mortality, it's just funny. So remember, he's questioning God, reads from the Book of Mormon, and now belief in God makes sense again.
Yeah, if you hang on just a second, let's just go back because we do have a few slides in between. This is what happened in his letter immediately before he says it. He quotes from, thank you for pointing this out. The story from Alma 14, which we've been at length and labor to criticize. That'll teach me to talk while I'm trying to advance the slides. And right after talking about that story, all of a sudden, it's so amazing. What does it do, Kolby? Go ahead from the beginning.
Just returns him back. I did not believe all at once, but for the first time in a while, belief in God made sense. If mortality is a blip on our eternal timetable, then our suffering here on earth would be but a small moment.
Okay, hang on a second, because it's like he sticks that story in the middle of what he's talking about, because he's returning to what he was talking about before that story from Alma.
Right.
And this is a different method that people have come up with. I don't think it's satisfactory, but you will hear it in order to respond to the problem of evil. It's a separate and distinct method of trying to resolve it from the one put forward in Alma. All right. So once again, this is elongate eternity to make the suffering here on this life so short and so small as to be really nothing significant and nothing to get worked up about.
Right. In that sense, though, it is kind of like everyone's familiar with sports for the most part. I'm not a sports ball guy, but let's say that it's really important to me that my football team wins the football game. it's so unfavorable to me that I'm using the same type of argument from consequences that Austin is to reach this conclusion here, right? I can always posit that football games don't end after 4 quarters, they actually end after 6. But unless I have a good reason to believe that there's these extra innings, that's not football, I get it. But unless I have a reason to believe that there is this actual extra time that Austin's creating here, you really are just offloading the problem onto the ifs. And I know you've already drawn attention to these ifs,
I've
but
counted 3 so far.
yeah, if mortality is a blip on the eternal timetable,
Oh, that's
then
4.
our
I'm
suffering
sorry.
here on
That's
earth
4.
would be, then our suffering would be but a small moment. Just notice the if, I guess is what I'm saying. We don't, Austin still has not presented a reason aside from wishful thinking that you should believe any of these ifs.
Yes. So far, his arguments for the existence of God and resolving the problem of evil have 4 ifs in them.
Right. So he continues and says, oh, I'm sorry.
Was that? Oh, this is the next slide.
I don't think I finished it. For God to be just and merciful, a reward must be given so that every man, woman, and child, no matter their toil on earth, would agree that it was all worth it. Each person would have to consent to experience this unjust mortal existence, knowing that their anguish may be intolerable.
Okay, so his way of dealing with the problem of evil is, number 1, everybody would have to consent to it, which implies a premortal existence, right? In order for it to be fair, they had to consent to it. Yes, I'll sign up for being burned to death. Thank you. Crucifixion or freedom. Isn't that how it goes at the end of Life of Brian? With a line going up to the guy who's deciding who's going to be crucified, and he gives them the choice, crucifixion or freedom. Oh, I'll take crucifixion, please. All right, line on the right. Consent to experience this unjust mortal existence, knowing that their anguish may be intolerable. That's the first thing he does, is he says it's got to be a choice. And second off, after the fact, after they get burned to death, even though they consented to it, they got to get some reward that's so good that it makes it worth being burned to death. Okay. So I put number 1, belief in God makes sense because he gives a stand down order to those who could help to not save women and children from burning to death. That was my first question, because that is what he is arguing. That belief in God makes sense because God gives a stand down order to those who could help to not save women and children from burning to death. I'm not sure that makes sense. For me, anyway.
All it is it's an apologetic for why God can still exist in this reality. None of it is convincing about why God actually exists. All it's doing is responding to a problem.
Very good. And a very naughty problem. Number 2, I put because
I was going to say, can I read your second one? Because I also had thoughts on this one.
Yeah.
Because those women and children consented to be burned in a prior life. Are you kidding me? Is what you wrote. And I do think, again, we've talked about differences between Mormonism and conventional Christianity. I do think this is actually one of the worst unique theological points, or more unique, I guess, to Mormonism than it is to conventional Christianity, is this belief in this premortal life where you did inherently consent to all of these things. And the reason I say that is because if you truly, truly believe that, when you look around at the world and you see people suffering, it is going to be very difficult for you to not at least think in the back of your mind as you pass the homeless guy, well, I know deep down that this man consented to everything that he's experiencing in this moment right now. And I also know theologically that God does not give us more than we can bear. There are some of these beliefs that as they percolate in your mind, and maybe even subconsciously, they lead you to believe that people may have consented, or that God is okay with people being treated in ways that you just have no real good reason to believe that. Again, these are responses to problems. They're not actual affirmative arguments for God's existence. They're just explaining why God can still exist given the reality that we experience.
I think if you were to take this belief to its logical conclusion, you would affirmatively not help other people out who are in a bad situation, because you would be interfering with their individual plan of salvation to which they consented in the premortal existence. I'm not sure that's a good conclusion, but I think it leads there ineluctably. Number 3, all because the people who are burning them to death can't be judged by God unless they succeed in completely burning them all to death. And finally, and belief in this kind of God makes sense to you, Austin? It doesn't to me. To me, this is a massive confusion, to quote an earlier version of the Temple Endowment. You want to read this one?
I sure do.
Oh, wait a second. Okay, go ahead. There's another if.
If there truly is a loving God, and this life is not the end, then somehow the wrongs and injustices of mortality must be made right. But how can God make the problem of evil right? The answer hit me all at once as if I never knew. There's another if for you.
Wait,
As if
where's
I
the
never
other if?
knew. As if I never knew.
Oh, if. It was
Jesus
in the middle
Christ.
of a sentence, as if.
It's
We're at
not
the
really
tick
a
now.
conditional, though. It's not really a conditional, so I guess it doesn't count. But
Okay,
he says,
I'm scratching it out.
the answer hit me all at once as if I never knew. Jesus Christ.
Is that
If-
the answer? Or is that his exclamation upon realizing it?
It's unclear. If an atoning Messiah would make all suffering, wrong, heartache, and even death right, then that would be good news indeed. If the gospel story is true, there's another one, then death is not the worst thing that can happen to us.
This reasoning is so strong that it requires no less, I should say, only 7 ifs in order to establish it. When you have an if, what you have is an unsupported premise for your argument. That's what an if signals. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, it's conditional, right? Ifs and thens. If the gospel story is true, then death is not the worst thing that can happen to us. So it's conditional on the if statement being true. If you've got that in a premise, the then is only true if the if is also true. Austin can't establish any of those ifs. And the funny thing about his argument, like you said, 7 if-then conditionals, each of them is dependent on the first if, because he's often taking if-then, 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 where the then from the first is part of the if from the second. And so all of them have one epistemic touch point that has been unstated or unproven, I guess.
Yes, each one, if then, moves you further out along the branch of your reasoning until you get far enough out that it snaps under its own weight and you go for a fall. So I had asked some questions. Had you gotten to the end of the quote from Austin?
Yes.
Where he ends with, if the gospel story is true, then death is not the worst thing that can happen to us. Now I want to say this first, okay? Because I was thinking about this last night after I made these comments on the slide. Today's date that we're recording this, by the way, is January 10th, 2026. It should premiere this evening at 6 o'clock p.m. Is that true? No, 7 o'clock p.m. Mountain Time. And the thing I wanted to say is this. Death is not the worst thing that can happen to us if the gospel story is true. Even in Austin's model, this statement is true only for those people who wind up in the celestial kingdom, who wind up in heaven. Okay? Only for them is death not the worst thing that can happen to us. Only for them does Jesus Christ make everything right again, make all those bad things good again. For everybody else in every other kingdom, including outer darkness, Jesus does not do the same work for them as he does for the people who go to heaven, what most Christians would call heaven, what Mormons would recognize as the top heaven, or actually the top level in the top heaven of the celestial kingdom. So this is what I was thinking last night. And you tell me what you think about this, Kolby. All right. He's saying the gospel story is true, then death is not the worst thing that can happen to us. Well, what about all those people for whom Jesus does not do the work of making all things right again? In other words, for the vast majority of people who don't go to the celestial kingdom. In other words, for the vast majority of people who do not live their lives according to the dictates of the Mormon church. Because that's what it comes down to. All right. And we can make this distinction really clear and just talk about celestial kingdom versus outer darkness. Okay. Mm-hmm. We can skip the kingdoms in between and make the distinction really clear, because obviously the people who are in outer darkness are not getting the benefit of Jesus's atonement. All right. Mm-hmm. What Austin is saying would be more reasonable, more likely to make sense if the people who go to the celestial kingdom are the only people who experience suffering in this life. because they are the only group of people for whom Jesus' sacrifice makes everything right again. It certainly does it for the people in outer darkness. Okay? So the problem with his idea is that everybody in mortality experiences suffering, not just the people who go to the celestial kingdom. The people who go to the terrestrial, telestial, outer darkness, all of them experience suffering here. Therefore, his premise that Jesus Christ makes everything right for everybody for their suffering, makes their suffering okay in some way, is not correct. Because people who have suffered here will continue to suffer in the afterlife based upon the decisions they made here. All I'm saying is that, let me throw it to you and see if this makes any sense to you before I muddle it any further.
So I can understand what you're saying is applied to those who go to outer darkness. I think even the scriptural phrase that's used in the New Testament that then Mormons interpret to be talking about sons of perdition or those who go to outer darkness is the phrase, "It had been better for that man had he not been born." That's
And weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth doesn't sound like a good time.
Right. Help me understand it as applied to the people in the terrestrial and celestial kingdoms, because my understanding is that those kingdoms of glory are so above this earth life that even though there might be more glory that could be attained in the celestial kingdom, I guess help me understand how it's not made right for those people in the middle kingdoms.
Okay. What I'm saying here is that he's talking about two really different things.
Mm-hmm.
If God makes all the suffering that everybody experiences here right in the afterlife, okay, then I think what that means is that you take belief out of it. You take religion out of it. You take living your life in a certain way out of it.
I see.
Because
okay.
You're already suffering here in this life. And if you put additional conditions on what you have to do in this life in order to not have that suffering, I mean, to make it right, whatever you want to call it, right, through Jesus, in the next life, then you're not accounting for all the people in this world who experience the same or even worse suffering, but who don't follow those conditions such that it's made okay in the next life.
Okay, let me explain, I think, what you're saying and help the audience understand it with using an example. Let's say we have two people who experience exactly identical levels of suffering in their life, but one of them is born into Mormonism and one of them is born, in the 1500s. This person can never, in their lifetime at least, accept Mormonism. The other person stays a faithful Mormon for their entire life.
And they're not going to accept it in the spirit world, okay?
That's what I was going to say. And they're not going to accept it in the spirit world. We're not going to use that out, that unfalsifiable out. This person may be going to the celestial kingdom. This person may be going to a different kingdom based purely on the way they obeyed or did not obey the gospel. Has nothing to do with the question of the suffering they received, which in this instance, for purposes of the hypothetical, was identical.
Which is why I think that in Luke, and only in Luke, they have the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. And the rich man is rich, and he's blessed because he's rich. Lazarus is the poor man. He's cursed because he's poor, but there's nothing about their belief that makes them rich or poor in the parable. There's nothing about what they do or have done in their lives, being obedient or disobedient to God. It's simply that one is rich and blessed in this life, and the other is very poor and not blessed in this life. And based upon that, and that alone in the parable, which is one of the things that makes it so interesting, based upon simply their status in this life and the fact that one has suffered and the other one has not suffered. In fact, he's been blessed, and whatever the opposite of suffering is, right? That the parable switches their positions in the afterlife.
Mm.
And it is done only for the purpose of making things right and making things just and ultimately making things fair, completely unmoored from any question of what these people believed. Did they believe correctly? Or what they did they do good works correctly? Or did they follow the commandments correctly? That's pure, I think. And that's one of the things that makes it attractive. That is a pure effort to try and account for the sufferings that everybody experiences in this life by saying that they will all be made better in the next life, regardless of what you believe or what you do.
Right. It's also kind of a flawed premise right from the start, in the sense that this is the same thing we talked about with Job, right? This idea that there can be a second life that can be better, or I can enjoy some benefit or blessing or benediction that makes any level of suffering I've experienced here mean nothing, is just kind of a weird hypothetical. Like if we were to take it to the legal field, which we share, and I were to punch you in the face and then pay you $1,000 afterwards, the fact that I paid you $1,000 after I punched you in the face does not mean that it is okay that I punched you in the face. And yet that seems to be the premise of this, which is God can do God can do or allow any amount of wrong to be done to you, so long as he pays you recompense on the back end. I
And he
just
gives you
don't.
$1,000 after you die.
Right. It's just kind of a flawed premise in that sense. I wouldn't call that justice.
Even in the law, we recognize, I mean, how many times have you heard a PI lawyer talk about how, money is not going to make you better.
Right.
It's not going to make it okay. It's not going to heal you. It's not going to make it so that this horrible thing, that whatever it is that happened to you, didn't happen to you. But it's all we've got.
Right.
That's all we've got. So maybe God has something better. We just don't know what it is. Let me see what else I had to say about this. Do only those people who suffer immortality go to heaven? I think this is when this idea was occurring to me and I was starting to put the little pieces together.
Yeah.
Is suffering made right for those who go to a lesser kingdom? Is suffering made right for those who go to outer darkness? Or is suffering made right only for those who go to the celestial kingdom? Is Austin arguing that mortal suffering is made right only for those who follow all the commandments of Mormonism? Because I'm getting the sneaking suspicion that that's what he's doing. And for everyone else, death is not the worst thing that can happen to us. Actually, I think I should put number 6. It's only for those who go to the celestial kingdom that death is not the worst thing that can happen to them. No. I did have it right. For everyone else, death is not the worst thing that can happen to us, because a lot worse stuff is going to happen to you after you die. I had it right the first time. Number 7, this is not a solution to the problem of evil. It is hire and salary. Okay. Did you have anything else you wanted to say? And by the way, thank you for clarifying my thoughts. It's the first time I've been trying to think about this, and reading this has been making me think about it in order to analyze what he's saying, because it just didn't seem right. And I've been trying to piece together why it is that it strikes me wrong. I think I've come up with at least part of it.
Yeah, it's one of those mixed messages. No, I don't think I have anything else to say. I think it's really interesting the way you built this out. I'm going to chew on it a little bit more, I think.
This is what happens when you can't get to sleep at night and you're Radio Free Mormon and you have a podcast the next morning with Kolby. Oh, yeah. So we got 7 ifs. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. If. It always makes me think of, first off, my favorite poem by Rudyard Kipling, but also this great story. One of the most famous examples of what a laconic phrase is. You ever heard of what laconic means? It means not using many words. Laconia is the, I think, province in which Sparta was located, or vice versa. I can't remember. One of the most famous examples of what a laconic phrase is had to do with King Philip II of Macedon. I think he's the dad of Alexander, who was in the process of launching a major campaign that would eventually lead to him controlling most of ancient Greece. As part of the campaign, he sent a note to ancient Sparta saying, "You are advised to submit without further delay. For if I bring my arms into your land," by the way, "for if I bring my arms into your army into your land, I will destroy your farms, slay your people, and raise your city." You want to read the last part?
In response, ancient Sparta replied to King Philip's threat with a simple one-word response: if.
This is the classic story that tells you what a laconic phrase is. Okay, 1 word, 2 letters, if, and it says it all. And that's what I think of when I hear 7 ifs coming from Austin in order to support his theory. That's my response. If. Yeah. And actually, even if all those things are correct, it doesn't support his theory. So it's worse than that. But
Right.
Oh, here we are again.
We're back for our second segment of Austin's Fallacy Hour. This is for Austin's edification. So if the gospel story is true, then death is not the worst thing that can happen to us. So I've broken this down again. Premise 1, if the gospel story is true, then death is not the worst thing that can happen to us. Premise 2, I am not convinced that death is the worst thing that can happen to us, See, therefore the gospel story is true, because that's the conclusion that Austin actually wants you to accept here. That's what he's doing. He's using that emotion of Jesus Christ is this simple answer, this simple phrase that hit him like it had never hit him before. The funny thing about this one is there are informal logical fallacies, which have to do with accepting patterns like the argument from consequences we talked about earlier. Those are valid in their form. They just can lead you to an incorrect conclusion. This argument is actually invalid in its form. So this is a formal logical fallacy. It is not even valid. And what that means, and the example of this, or the textbook definition of it, is what is called affirming the consequent. And what he's doing here is you know what? Give me 2 seconds to think about this. You're going to have to edit
I'm going to give you
out.
2 seconds to think about it. I'll just talk about it a bit here.
Great.
Because I'm a little bit lost. I've heard of affirming the consequent, but it always confuses me just a bit. So you've broken down Austin's argument into premise 1. If the gospel story is true, then death is not the worst thing that can happen to us. That's actually quoting him. Premise 2, I am not convinced. This is yours. I am not convinced that death is the worst thing that can happen to us. Therefore, the gospel story is true. So that's very, very interesting the way you do that. I think that is almost subliminally in there, that if we agree with him on his premise that death is not the worst thing that can happen to us, then therefore the gospel must be true. It does seem that he was sucked along with that kind of reasoning, because in the matter of just a few paragraphs, he ends up Mormon again.
Yeah, and as you did that, I can explain it better now. So let me explain why this structure of this argument is a problem, but by using an analogy. If it is raining outside, then my grass will be wet. My grass is wet, therefore it is raining. The problem here, and the problem...
was that the consequent, the second thing?
Yeah, the problem...
That was wrong.
The problem with affirming the consequent is it ignores that there are other conditionals that can prove that then statement.
I said it was wrong. I should have said it's not necessarily true.
Exactly. So there are other reasons, in my analogy, there are other reasons that the grass could be wet beyond just it's raining. So it is a true statement. It is a valid, or it is a sound premise to say that if it is raining, then my grass will be wet. But my grass can get wet also from the sprinklers when it is not raining. And so here is the problem in the structure of Austin's very argument. And yes, the first premise is the only one that's actually in the text. The others are unstated, but I do believe it's an accurate representation of the argument he's making here, which is if the gospel story is true, then death is not the worst thing that can happen to us. He believes that death is not the worst thing that can happen to us. Therefore, the gospel story is true. That is incorrect, because death is not the worst thing that can happen to us, can be believed for entirely different reasons than the gospel story being true, including the fact that me, as someone who does not believe the gospel story nor believe in an afterlife, also believes that death is not the worst thing that can happen to us. So this helps show the flaw in the structure itself of his argument.
Brilliant. It's almost like that famous argument that Socrates is a man, is premise 1, premise 2, all men have 2 legs. Therefore, the conclusion is all men are named Socrates. Kind of like that one. Okay, yes. Let's try the next one. And he goes on in his letter, something became manifestly clear. As I sorted these thoughts out in my mind, I was recreating the story of the gospel of Jesus Christ taught in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Who'd have thunk it? From the ashes, he was recreating this story, Mormonism, from the ashes of my disbelief. Well, that's what's going to happen when you use the Book of Mormon in order to reconstruct your belief. I think that would be predictable, actually. He says, not only could I finally see how I could believe in God again, but I saw that the restoration provided a reasonable explanation for how it all worked. And I think we've seen how reasonable that explanation is.
Right. And I added this little image of the Ouroboros at the bottom, which is the mythological idea of a snake eating its own tail, because the way he put that, I was recreating the story of the gospel of Jesus Christ taught in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints from the ashes of my disbelief. If all you did was question your belief and then resolve those questions by going back to the same theological material that gave you that belief in the first place, you haven't gone anywhere except in a circle.
Even within the myth to which he references, the myth of the phoenix arising from its ashes, it's always the same phoenix that arises from its own ashes.
Exactly.
Yeah, good point. Okay, next one. He goes into a subsection titled The Scale of Belief. And here he borrows, of course, heavily from Terrell Givens, I expect, who likes the ass of Burden analogy. Though I had sorted out how I could believe. See, he's already able to believe in God again. That did not mean I did believe quite yet. That is when I started exploring the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints with fresh eyes. So he's back in Mormonism. I spent countless hours, 1, 2, I think you can count 2, reading and listening. Maybe you can't. Maybe that's the problem here. I spent countless hours. Maybe Austin's one of those guys who can't count up to 11 without unzipping his pants. I spent countless hours reading and listening to critics and apologists alike. Really? Countless hours listening to critics? I think you spent maybe half an hour listening to critics and countless hours on the apologists. I learned church history from the faithful and critical narratives. I listened to the stories of members of the church who left and former members who returned. I went down every rabbit hole I could find. I learned the good, the bad, and the ugly of previous church policies. I asked, like the priesthood ban, right? Oh, yeah. I asked countless hard questions. Countless, I tell you, countless hard questions. And left myself completely open to light and truth. And my note was, all I can say is that Austin Fife's entire book gives little evidence this statement is true and abundant evidence it is not. What do you think of this, Kolby?
I agree with this completely. A few weeks ago, I joined you guys briefly on Mormonism After Dark, and I said something about how I wish we had said a little bit less about the intention behind Austin's letter. And I think the way you said it here is all I wish I had ever said about this, which is just to say, looking at what Austin has written, it is very difficult for me to believe that he spent countless hours reading and listening to critics and apologists alike, because there are so many arguments that he does not deal with, that he seems completely unaware of. I remember when he appeared with our mutual friend Steve Pinecker, and Pinecker asked him about like who had informed his journey out of the church towards atheism or burgeoning atheism. He used
Who did he read? What books did he read? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, or who he listened to. I remember when Steve asked him specifically about the 4 horsemen of the new atheist movement, Dawkins, Dennett, Harris, and Hitchens, that Austin, I think, knew of Dawkins from listening to responses to Dawkins. And so, you know, if I were to try and steel man Austin's position, I'm sure he feels like he has listened to a lot of critics. But if I had to really guess, it's because what he's listened to are responses to those critics, instead of actually listening to the critics for themselves and then listening to responses. Of course, you want to listen to both sides of an issue so that you have more information. But I agree with everything you said here, which is Austin's book does give very little evidence that he went down these rabbit holes. He said he learned the good, bad, and ugly of previous church policies. He doesn't really talk about many of those good, bads, and uglies of previous church policies.
I don't think he talks at all about the priesthood ban, did he? It's been over a year.
If he did talk about the priesthood ban, I think he did talk about the priesthood ban, because we talked about the Lowry Nelson letter in one of the last couple of weeks of discussion we had done. So he must have talked about it a little bit. But what I can tell you for sure is he doesn't go down the rabbit hole in his book. I'm sure he would say, well, that's because there are other ways you can learn about that entire rabbit hole. And that's probably true.
Yes, I'm just writing a book to respond to all of these things. Right. I don't know why you would expect to find me responding to things in a book that I've said responds to things.
You will have some responses in your response book, won't you? Yeah, I guess the way I would say it, especially as we draw to a conclusion on this whole project, is I agree with the way you've captured it here, which is I don't have to question the legitimacy of Austin's faith crisis or experience. It's not like he has to have listened to all these critics to have written a book like this.
Right.
But the problem is that in the book, he claims that he did.
Yeah.
And that's the problem, is there's nothing in this book that reflects that he really understands these issues at anything more than a really elementary level and an elementary Mormon level at that. Like, it doesn't look like he's ever really explored other theological systems or some of the details of these theological problems.
Thank you. I'll leave it at that. He goes on, with time, I discovered something I could never, I discovered something, period. With time, I discovered something. I could never prove that the Church of Jesus Christ is true. Well, that's interesting, since I think that was the point of his whole book. But he says, or false. So I could never prove that the Church of Jesus Christ, he's talking about the Mormon Church, by the way, is true or false. I could never prove it. Well, and I said, no religion can be proven true or false. It's the nature of faith, Austin. I don't know why this is a huge shock to you.
It's also a ridiculous thing to say, because proving something true versus proving something false is an entirely different proposition. You don't go into a trial having to prove that what the other side has said is false. Instead, this is the way burdens of proof work, Austin. Instead, the person who's making the positive claim has to support their positive claim, not necessarily with proof. I think proof is really overstating it. It's really only a concept in mathematics and like formal logical structures. But let's just say evidence or good reasons. That's what people mean when they're talking about proof. You shouldn't have to give good reasons not to believe in something. Let me say that again. The null set should be not believing in something until you have a good reason to do that. So even the way he's doing this is just such a flawed way of thinking, like you have to make a choice between these two things. The default should be agnosticism, meaning I don't know, on any proposition until you've had enough compelling evidence offered to you to believe that proposition.
Well put. He admits negatives lurked around the corner. Every corner. Negatives lurked around the corner, no matter how much positive evidence I found. Likewise, when I learned something unflattering, some unflattering aspects of the restoration, a logical counter-explanation presented itself, which made me go off in a series of questions. Please provide your logical counter-explanation for Joseph Smith marrying teenage girls and marrying already married women behind his lawful wife's back. Can you do that, Austin? Could you provide a logical counter explanation for that? Please provide your logical counter explanation for how the Book of Abraham proves Joseph Smith's claim of being able to translate Egyptian into English. Could you do that for me, Austin? And finally, please provide your logical counter explanation for why God instituted a racist ban on black people, that they could not receive the priesthood or go to the temple for over a century. What's your logical counter explanation that presented itself for that, Austin? He says, eventually my scale, by the way, before I get to this last part, did you want to comment on this?
No.
Eventually, he writes, my scale of belief versus disbelief felt about 50-50. Now, first off, that is hopelessly optimistic for a Mormon to say that. Although he's not the only one. Jim Bennett's dad wrote a book in which he said the same thing. I was more prone to want to believe it at the time. Now I think I'm a little bit more objective. No, it's not 50-50. Your scale of belief versus disbelief, that's a personal thing, but based on the evidence. Okay, if all the evidence that you had in your book were correct, Austin, it wouldn't be anywhere close to 50-50. It might be 5-95. All right? That's if everything in your book were correct. We've shown that most of it is not correct or hopelessly overstated, which takes it down to at least 3%. It is nowhere near 50-50. But you're saying that because you know you're going to make an argument next that's based upon the idea of your having 50-50 belief versus disbelief. Now, here's the other idea that came to me this morning. I was getting ready to come down to the office to record this with you. Even if he's correct that his scale of belief versus disbelief felt about 50-50, based upon the evidence, that proves Mormonism is not true.
Or that you would be, that God, Mormon God, would be requiring you to believe it based on bad evidence, on bad reasons. Because if you're willing to use that epistemology to believe anything that you think can be about 50-50, particularly something so important and so miraculous, what wouldn't you be able to believe based on that same standard? That's the special pleading problem that we've talked about a number of times, which is I just refuse to believe that God gave me a brain and that he gave me all of the ability to read and understand things and to think through and to logic through things. It's even built into Mormonism. You took no thought but save it were but to ask me. Instead, you need to study these things out in your mind, right? That's given to Oliver Cowdery when he fails to translate. This idea that God would expect you to lower your epistemic bar to believe the most important things which are also entirely unfalsifiable, by the way. I just refuse to believe that. I guess I believe better of God's character if he does exist than Austin does. I just don't believe that God would expect us to do that.
Well, the reason I put that up there, Kolby, is because, and I stated it so strongly, so let me go ahead and explain why it was I stated it as strongly as I did. If you hang on just a second here, because I was finding something else here. Okay. It's because I'm speaking specifically about the Book of Mormon, and a great deal of his book has dealt with arguments about the Book of Mormon. If your scale of belief versus disbelief in the Book of Mormon is 50-50, what that reflects is the evidence that you have presented and the rabbit holes that you claim to have gone down. If the Book of Mormon has 50% evidence for its truth, 50% evidence for it not being true, some of that 50%, if not all of it, constitutes anachronisms, things that should not be in the Book of Mormon and that nevertheless are. And we've seen so many of those as we've gone over the book. The reason why I say that when you say my scale of belief versus disbelief in the Book of Mormon felt about 50-50, it proves the Book of Mormon is not true, because all it takes is one anachronism.
Sure.
To prove the Book of Mormon is not true. If there were 100 anachronisms and one of them was a true anachronism that really you couldn't get your way around, okay, that would be 99-1. It would still mean the Book of Mormon is not true.
Right.
You've admitted it's 50-50. So that's 50 times more not true than the one it takes to not be true in the first place.
Right.
Okay. Now, the other thing I wanted to bring up about the brain, you said that God gave us. My mom used to say God gave you a brain for more than just to hold your ears apart. What it is, I am looking here in Hamlet again. This is from his last, I believe, soliloquy, Act 4, Scene 4. The one that starts, how all occasions do inform against me and spur my dull revenge. He goes right into it. What is a man if his chief good and market of his time be but to sleep and feed? A beast. That's all they do is sleep and feed and make little sharks. A beast, no more. Then it says this, sure, he that made us with such large discourse, looking before and after, future and past, gave us not that capability and godlike reason to fuss in us unused. So same idea, right? God didn't give us a brain for us not to use it, did he? So we should use it in order to figure out God and what it is that he would have of us if he exists. Okay, so I've gotten to Hamlet twice today. We'll see if I can make it 3 before the day is over. So I said no religion can be... Oh, I've already gone through all these comments, so we're ready to go to the next slide. This is his scale. This is the 50-50 scale, disbelief versus belief. Okay, and all I can say is these are the kind of statements that indicate Austin has not spent countless hours listening to critics, because he thinks that disbelief in the Book of Mormon or in Mormonism is equal based on evidence with belief.
Have we seen a single example in Austin's chapters to this point where, aside from him quote mining and cherry picking, which is one of his own manipulation tactics and logical fallacies from ex-Mormons, have we seen a single example of where he's actually cited critical research, papers, or scholarship? I don't believe we have seen one yet.
Do you mean has he cited only apologetic or neutral sources and never delved into a citation to a critical source?
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is one of the things I like about this series is that we always allow Austin's chapters in almost every instance to speak for themselves in their entirety, and then we do our comments. That's very normal also in court proceedings, right? Like you quote from the other side's brief, you provide your counter argument. If Austin had truly spent countless hours listening to critics, it would seem like maybe he would have citation to some of their arguments that then he is responding to. Instead, he seems to only be responding to social media memes. It's not like he's providing an example of an argument made by Dan Vogel or Brent Metcalf, serious scholars in Mormon studies on the critical side, and then saying, but here's my explanation. I guess it's very difficult for me to believe, again, that he has spent those countless hours actually engaging with critical positions when they're not reflected anywhere in what he's written.
That's a good point. Very good. I'm glad you brought that up. Just another of the many ways in which this letter is light on truth. So here we go to the next part. It's a very, very small snippet. Can you read this that he wrote?
Yes. I realized I had to make a decision. No, you didn't. I had to believe in something. Whether I
No, you
believe
didn't.
or
I was going to say it after you there. No, you didn't. You don't have to do either of those things, Austin. You are manufacturing a narrative that supports what you did, which was to get back in the good graces of your wife.
get out of that laundry room.
We all know it's true.
Whether I believed or did not believe, either was a leap of faith. I hate this projection so much. I don't believe there. And what I mean by this is I don't think there is anything I've accepted in my life based on faith today. I don't think there's a single thing that someone could point to if we really talked with the Hebrews definition of what faith is, which is belief in things not seen, right?
Mm-hmm.
I just don't believe that there's anything I've accepted based on that solely as my evidence. But of course,
what he's saying is whether I took a leap of faith or didn't take a leap of faith, either one was a leap of faith.
Yeah, and they have to, it feels to me like they have to do that. They have to project that onto you to say, well, you're doing the same thing just in reverse. You just decided to jump the direction of non-belief. No, I was raised from the time I was a toddler to believe these things, and now I no longer do because I changed my mind based on evidence. Anyways, he then concludes, in due time, I decided that I would believe. And I will say, kudos for honesty, Austin, but I don't just decide what I'm going to believe. That's not, I don't use that model.
Nobody
I really
does.
don't.
Nobody does. It's anti-human. Human beings don't do this, Austin. You can't decide what you're going to believe. You believe what you believe. You can't decide differently unless you're fooling yourself. So I asked, why do you, it's similar to you, why do you have to make a decision, Austin? Because you actually don't have to make a decision. What outside force is working on Austin to compel him to make a decision? Then I said, this is a classic high-pressure sales technique that Austin is applying to himself. Limited time only. Only 4 left in stock. You need to make a decision within the next 20 minutes. Otherwise, the sale goes away. I had to make a decision. He is forcing himself to buy this car.
Right.
Is the fact I personally don't believe, this is me talking, is the fact I personally don't believe the Catholic Church is true, is that a leap of faith?
Yeah, I'm really glad you phrased it like that, but that's what I was talking about here. This is why you can't see disbelief as the same exact as choosing to believe things the way Austin did, because there are so many faith systems that then by Austin's own standard, he's taken the leap of faith not to believe in. He doesn't believe in Vishnu or all of these different gods that have existed since the beginning of history. But he wouldn't admit that he's making a leap of faith not to believe in those things. This is, again, just projection.
Good point. And conversely, I cannot choose to believe the Catholic Church is true. I could live my life pretending that I did, but inside I would know I didn't really. Number 4, you cannot decide to believe in anything. This harks back to what we said before.
Right.
You, Austin, are trying to use the old apologetic that because the evidence was completely even on both sides, you had to choose which side to go with. The idea the evidence is actually equal in favor of the Book of Mormon as against it is risible. Yes, risible, I tell you, Austin. Oh, now I put this on there. That's right. The now or never close. This is actually taught as one of the principles of salesmanship, right? The now or never close. Only 10 spots left this month. Create urgency without losing trust. Austin created urgency for himself. Or did he? Was someone else creating that urgency, perhaps? And here is Buridan's ass, which I learned a little bit about. This is what it is that Terrell Givens uses as this explanation. And it's what he's borrowing from, the 50-50, the two piles of hay, equally large, equal in every way, piles of hay. And you put this donkey right in between them. And what it was that Buridan actually said, it's interesting. Let me go back here and say, this is the way that I understood it from Terrell Givens, is that Buridan's ass, it stands for the proposition, is that if you have equally attractive choices in every way, then you have to choose one or the other, okay? So you do choose to believe if it's absolutely equal, which is the point that I knew Austin was driving at when he made the humorous comment that he came to the point where his belief was 50-50.
Right.
Okay, you can see these coming a mile away. So that's Buridan's ass, but actually it's not Buridan's ass. Buridan's ass was that same idea, except standing for the proposition that in such a situation where you don't have evidence that one choice is better than the other, that you should suspend judgment. This is what Buridan said. That makes sense to me. It was the critics of Buridan who said, critics later satirized this claim with the paradox of Buridan's ass, which I explained to you, right? As many of Buridan's examples use donkeys. So this is Buridan's ass. So this isn't what Buridan said it stood for. This is what the critics of it said it stood for. And I would say that in most situations in life, including choosing what you're going to believe religiously, that you should have better than 50% evidence that it's true against 50% evidence that it's not. And until you do, you should suspend judgment.
Or, the paradox arises. The reason people use the paradox, it sounds like they're incorrectly restating Buridan's ideas, but the way that people have satirized this also makes me think of there's practicality, right? Like no one wants to, and I think the way Terrell Givens has used it is no one wants to be so absurdly concerned with truth or goodness that they'll sit between two truly equal options and not make a decision. And that's then where just practicality comes in and says, then just if they're two equally sized piles of hay, just go towards one or the other. What does it matter?
Right. And this is a theoretical thing. You put a donkey there, donkey's going to go to which one ever. They're not going to starve to death between two equal piles of hay. A donkey's going to go to one or the other and eat, and then it'll go to the second one.
Right. And my point with people using this idea theologically is if they're going to then pivot to practicality and making a decision based on practicality, you can't then pivot back and start talking about truth. Using an example like this is very clearly saying that I'm only really concerned with the utility of those beliefs. I am not concerned with whether those beliefs are actually true. So if you're going to use this type of thinking, Austin, you have to follow it all the way through and just own the fact that you really don't care if your belief in the church is true, if it's legitimate, if it's grounded. Instead, you're doing it for practical reasons.
I also wanted to add to this because I think it's a little bit two-dimensional when it comes to variables. All you have is two piles of hay. Well, if one of those piles of hay is Mormonism, you have got a great deal more sacrifice tied up in the value of that pile of Mormon hay.
Sure.
Because you're going to have to pay tithing and sacrifice and do all the things that we know that you do as a Mormon for your entire life. Temple, church, the whole 9 yards. For your entire life, if you're going to eat of this pile of hay. And if the other pile of hay doesn't have all of those burdens, fardals, associated with it, then that makes the second pile of hay much more enticing than the first pile of hay, even if they're even. Okay. Can you read this part from his letter?
Giving up on the I know statements I was accustomed to in exchange for I believe declarations was incredibly liberating. The gospel that I knew so well became new and exhilarating to me. My scale has shifted over the years, but I have never regretted my decision to become a believing member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Never? I thought his story, well, I don't know. Okay. I guess he never regretted it, in spite of all of his shifting alliances. My thoughts were this. One, how has your scale shifted over the years? In what way? It almost only makes sense that you would say that if it had shifted in such a way that there was less than 50% for the church, right? Did it only shift that there was more belief than disbelief? It must have shifted to places where there was more disbelief than belief, right? So that's why I ask, how has your scale shifted over the years? Are you saying at some point in your life you have had more reason to disbelieve than to believe?
It feels like inherently he's saying that because this is coming after he says he reached this 50-50 perspective. So if it's shifted at all, then it's no longer 50-50.
Yes.
Yeah.
Are you saying, Austin, that you continued in Mormonism even when you had more reasons to disbelieve than to believe? Because that's what it sounds like, at least for some period of time or periods of time. This is not logical behavior. It is not rational behavior. It is faithful behavior. In the absence of evidence, it is faithful behavior, and it is faithful behavior in the absence of evidence. Mormon is more likely than not true. So I think that what he did here was he tipped his hand and he told us that at least at some periods in his life, he doesn't follow this or has not followed it because at some points in his life, the disbelief has been greater than the belief, but he's hung in there faithful anyway. Why won't you share with us, Austin? Why won't you share with us what caused those experiences to make your disbelief greater than your belief? And how it is that you recovered from that?
Mm-hmm. And the reason I think that last question is really important is, I know Austin has, you referenced earlier, he doesn't like that one thumbnail, really doesn't like that one thumbnail. He's been using it for months on Twitter.
I think he really likes it, actually, because
that's
it
what I was
gives
going
him
to
an
say.
excuse for
He
not
likes it
coming
because,
on the show.
Yeah, he's used it as his really only dodge for not having any type of conversation with us. And you referenced that earlier. I think one of the things that he just will not be able to understand is if he were able to share some of those experiences of like how he worked through some of these things, I know he's already convinced that there's nothing that could change our minds. That is not true. Like, I have had so many experiences, the same way Austin says he's never regretted his decision to become a believing member of the church. I have never regretted my decision to start applying consistent epistemology in my life. And what I mean by that is I have had so many experiences where my wife has shared something with me that I immediately say, or a friend or whatever, someone has shared something with me, an opinion that I say, that cannot possibly be right, or that doesn't sound right based on what I've heard or learned. And then there have been times where people have shared things with me that have completely shifted my mind or my understanding on things because I am willing to change my mind. And having the assurance that I've changed my mind in the past allows me to know that even if I believe things that are untrue, because every single one of us believes things that are untrue all of the time. We can't spend all day navel gazing trying to determine like every single thing that is true and not true about our worldview. We have to use some shortcuts and use schema to work through our lives. But I do gain some reassurance in knowing that I've had experiences over the last couple of years where when someone has shared with me evidence that challenges my opinions, my previously held opinions, I have changed my mind. Because what that tells me is that I'm at least applying an epistemology that means that if I'm confronted with that evidence in the future that should require me to change my mind, I at least know based on past experience that I have. And that is a very valuable thing to know, to put your mind at ease about how you're navigating what is and isn't true.
Something interesting along those lines that it brings to my mind is what you had told me that you actually had some kind of latent hopes when you read this letter at the outset, when you started to read this letter, wondering if maybe this person, Austin, could present some evidence that would make you think the church might be true again?
That's true. I completely forgot about that because it's been so long. But yeah, when I first read it, I remember feeling, and I remember posting him on Reddit about this before we had started this series. That's why I was interested in doing it with you. Is I remember feeling this trepidation of reading that, starting reading the Light and Truth letter, saying, "Wow, what if this changes my mind? That would require a lot of changing in my life." Based on the last couple of years, and it would require me to admit that I've been wrong. And then I started reading it, and I realized I mean, I'm not saying my mind could never be changed, but it definitely cannot be changed by the likes of these types of arguments. But yeah, I remember feeling that excitement and that trepidation of maybe I get to change my mind about something. It's one of the things that's most surprising to me about where we're at. Both, I'm not going to speak partisan politics, I just mean politically, and on really difficult questions like religion, is it is often viewed as if changing your mind on a topic is a bad thing, like that it's inherently better to stick to your conclusion. And I just don't share that opinion. I actually really enjoy having my mind changed because it means I've learned something. There's that phrase, it's anonymously attributed, but it really resonated with me at the beginning of my faith crisis. It says, an honest man when he is I'll need
When
to
an
look.
honest man
When an
discovers
honest
he's
man
mistaken.
discovers he is mistaken, he will cease being mistaken, or he will cease being honest. Thank you. That's the way I look at it. Is there's nothing wrong with admitting that you don't know something and that you need to change your opinion. In fact, that's behavior that we need to reward in people more.
I want to tell everybody one of my favorite stories about you. We were having a phone discussion over a year ago. And we were talking about some issue. It was something about on the world stage, and it wasn't religious. And I can't remember what it was, but fortunately, what it was is not important.
Mm.
It's that I had launched into one part of the argument, and Kolby was taking the other side of the argument, whatever it was. And then I stopped and I said, Kolby, I really don't know enough about this subject to really be able to talk about it intelligently. And then Kolby pauses and he says, I really don't either. And we could just let it go. We probably would have let it go anyway, but I just thought that was great. You remember that?
Yeah, we've had a few of those types of conversations where you don't have to agree with every single thing that some one of your friends believes to have an interesting conversation.
Right.
In fact,
and it's great to recognize that, there's very few things that any of us would consider ourselves experts on, or at least reasonably consider ourselves experts on. I'm somewhat of an expert on Mormonism, but that's been because it's been so long studied and, decades of stuff.
And
But, yeah,
that's where I think it just comes back to, like, what is the motive in a conversation? If you'll pull up that slide we were on, I'll kind of finish this thought here. When you look at the way he's talking about this, it's operating from this assumption that, like, changing your mind is a bad thing, right? He just ended right back where he began. And I just don't see it the same way. I really don't. Whether it's at work or conversations with you, conversations with my wife, I really think the best we can do as humans is be honest about the way we see things and look at it as, maybe this person can share something with me that might change my perspective, change my opinion. Also, maybe it won't, right? But you'll at least have the benefit of actually understanding that person's perspective. I think those are the types of conversations that is very difficult for me to see coming from the apologetic side, of really sitting with the criticism, the actual steelman version of a criticism, and working through it. That doesn't mean they have to agree with it. Notice. It just means, like, having an actual conversation about the way they see it.
Like Jacob Hansen saying that if this were Joseph Smith's handwriting, it would be pretty damning. Then finding out it's Joseph Smith's handwriting and then throwing it away like it doesn't matter.
Yeah, you just got to look closely. What that behavior shows, and what I felt throughout this entire letter, is it's looking at it more like a debate, in the sense that I need to win this conversation. And the difference, I think, the way I feel about these types of conversations is there is no winning. It's just you sharing your perspective with the person the way you see and understand things, and the other person gets a chance to do that. Later today from when we're recording this, but earlier today from when this will release, I had a conversation several weeks ago with Stephen Murphy, an apologist for the church, who has gone through a legitimate faith crisis, and the language that he uses really shows me that he understands the issues. He's had lots of conversations with folks like Dan Vogel. We talk about the witnesses, and it's the exact type of conversation that I wish we were able to have with more of these apologists, but I truly don't think that like Austin is ready for it based on the way we are looking at what he said, even here in this passage, as well as the rest of the chapter.
So is what you're saying is that between the time we're recording and the time this is going to premiere tonight on the evening of Saturday, January 10th, that other episode you did with Steve Murphy is going to air?
That's right. Yeah. He just messaged me while we took a brief break. And what we do is we talk about the witnesses, where he and I have a conversation about what did you learn about the witnesses when you were growing up in the church? What did you learn about the witnesses when you were growing up in the church? Here are some reasons I think that they're maybe compelling evidence to me. Here are some reasons I don't think they're compelling evidence.
Yes.
It was a great conversation, and neither one of us had to, while both of us had the opportunity to learn from each other's perspective and potentially change our minds, there wasn't an agenda in that conversation. And so often in these conversations with apologists or responses with these types of apologists, I just don't see that same willingness to be wrong.
Yes, and I'll tell you, when as a defense attorney, talking with prosecutors about cases and seeing if we can resolve cases and negotiations and all that, there's two different kinds of prosecutors in this regard: those who can dance and those who can't. And here by dance, I mean those who will talk with you honestly and openly about the respective strengths and weaknesses of the case in question, both evidentiary and legal, with legal issues, and be able to say, yeah, that could be a problem, and I see what you're saying. And then they talk, and I say, and I acknowledge the weaknesses in my case, right? That's one person. That's one kind of prosecutor, and I could name them right now, but I won't. And then there's other prosecutors that you go and you talk to, and it's like, you know, you're talking in their office or they're in your office, but you're usually in their office because they're prosecutors. And so they're acting as if they're in court, and they're just arguing with you, and anything you say, they're just shooting down or throwing aside or saying, no, that's not right. You know, even though they know, well, it could be, and maybe we should talk about it. It's just very different discussions that you have with somebody who's willing to talk, I'm going to say honestly, about the respective strengths and weaknesses of a case, versus talking to someone who's just saying, no, there's no weaknesses in my case, and the only weaknesses are in your case.
Yeah, and the way people approach those conversations, I think, says a lot about what we've been talking about, like their perspective on how willing they are to change their mind. My boss currently, I normally don't really talk a lot about what I do for my day job. And I just want to share one brief thing about that, which is my boss hired me in part because before I worked for the agency I work for, I sued the agency I work for and won. And to have a boss that cares so much about getting the law right that they were willing to hire someone that proved them wrong in court, I think says a ton about that person's integrity and shows that they are more akin to those good prosecutors you were talking about than those prosecutors who would insist they're right even when they know deep down they're probably wrong.
You know, it is kind of a reveal. It's striking me right now that for hundreds of pages in this letter, in this book he's writing, he has been vanquishing the field. He has been conquering every criticism that's put forward. He should be at 100% belief. After what we've read in his book, according to what he's written, the big reveal is, after it all, he admits, I'm not saying I know anymore. I'm just saying I believe. And by the way, I'm down to 50-50. What is it that brought you down to 50-50? Austin? Okay, next slide. He continues, I do not have every answer to every one of my questions. I think you did for all the questions that you covered, didn't he? Is he talking about the ones he didn't cover? Maybe those are the ones he doesn't have answers for.
Maybe.
However, I can say this much with a degree of certainty. Something special happened between 1820 and 1845. That's in bold, by the way. He wants to stress that part. This is what he can say with a degree of certainty, which is something special happened between 1820 and 1845. And that's when I lost it. And I said, that's it? Something special happened between 1820 and 1845? That is all that is left of your testimony, Austin? This conclusion is so understated as to not be worthwhile even making. I will grant you something special happened between 1820 and 1845, Austin. I would have thought all your evidence-loaded chapters would have led to something a little more faith-promoting. And I conclude by saying, I understand the practice of understating one's conclusions. But your conclusion is so understated, I am left to wonder why you bothered writing a book to defend it. Wow.
Well put.
So his whole book is leading to the proposition that something special happened between 1820 and 1845. I'm convinced, and I'm not kidding. I do agree something special happened between 1820 and 1845, and you didn't have to write a book to convince me. He finishes that part. It was easy to come to that conclusion for all of the reasons listed in this letter and many more. You didn't need your letter. You didn't need your book to come to that conclusion. I will grant you that much. What are your thoughts about this, Kolby?
Yeah, that's exactly how I feel. Like when I see something special happen between 1820 and 1845, my immediate thought, maybe just because it's a date that's stuck in my mind and it's sarcastic, is I agree that the Missouri Compromise happened in 1820, Austin, but that's how trivial what he's saying here is. Like, think of what can count as a hit for what he's saying here, that something special happened. There's so many different things. Now, I know I'm being facetious. He's talking about Mormonism, but that's it. Something special
Mormonism
happened.
is special. It's unusual. Yeah. It's even unique in some ways. So definitely something special happened. I don't know why he goes 1845, but I'll give him the extra year. It's okay.
Yeah, sure. I had the same thought.
I mean, really, how much did this journey of his cost him in his testimony? If that's what it's reduced to. Maybe it had more impact on him than he's willing to admit. Then he says this. Can you read this?
Yep.
This is toward the end.
Most importantly, I have come to a personal relationship with God that I cannot adequately understand. I am baffled that the God of the universe can communicate with me. In those quiet moments when I seek him in prayer and he responds, I am awestruck. How can he, the God above all, listen to my cares and wants? How is it that he, the highest and holiest one, listens to me and answers my prayers? I do not know, but I am amazed that he does.
What do you think of that, Kolby?
I think I added something on the next slide, actually.
Do you know what this picture's from?
I don't.
That's Harvey. That's the last scene of Harvey as Jimmy Stewart walks off into the sunset with his big, giant, 6-foot rabbit friend. That nobody can see except for he. Was this the next one?
Yeah, I just added this line from this quatrain from the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. Because when someone's willing to concede that the biggest reason, because he does say most importantly, the biggest reason they believe is that they have a personal relationship with God, I can't really challenge that.
Right.
That can't be transferred to me, nor would I intend to challenge that. But I do think this quatrain really puts it well. It says, and do you think that unto such as you, a maggot-minded, starved, fanatic crew, God gave a secret and denied it me? Well, what matters it? Believe that, too. And what I mean by that is, if it assuages Austin's cognitive dissonance to say he's got a personal relationship with God, that's fine. But I have sincerely sought that relationship since my faith crisis and have not found it. And I think the way that, Omar Khayyam really draws this home is if you're willing to believe that God's given you the secret and hasn't given it to other people, why? Like, why are you willing to believe that? That's where he sarcastically kind of says, what matters it? Believe that too. That's the way I look at it, I guess. This is what people would call the problem of divine hiddenness, Why are there non-resistant non-believers in the God that Austin is talking about here? That is very difficult to reconcile with this model of God. And so while I would not question the legitimacy of what Austin feels he has, this personal relationship, my question in response to it is, then why don't I have that relationship despite sincerely wanting one if this God really exists the way it's been posited?
This entire paragraph is customary, loaded with spongy language that ends up not meaning anything.
Mm.
All it is him saying, wow, God's so great, and I have a personal relationship with him, and we play, cribbage every Friday evening. He doesn't have a personal relationship with God. I'll just say it, okay? You don't have a personal relationship with God. You like to think that you do, okay? What you have is a relationship with yourself, and what you do with yourself is your business. But this is it. I'm baffled that the God of the universe can communicate with me. Okay, what has he done to say hi? What are you talking about? You won't say because there's nothing to relate. That's the whole point I'm making. This is all subjective, navel-gazing BS as far as I'm concerned. The other part is this personal relationship with God is implicitly, it must be within the confines of Mormonism.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be. Now, if we had Austin on the show, I expect he would immediately start saying, no, it's not just people who are not Mormon can have a personal relationship with God, at which point he would have fallen into the trap of his own creation, which is simply this. If you can have a personal relationship with God outside Mormonism, then why is Mormonism necessary? Or is a personal relationship with God not enough? You see, we could have such a wonderful discussion if you just come on the show, Austin. Wouldn't that be interesting? We could all learn a lot more. So implicitly, this must be within Mormonism, this personal relationship with God that he's talking about. And I'm not sure what God is saying to him because he doesn't tell us. I'm not sure what the experience that he's having because he won't tell us. All he does is hint and suggest at it rather than describe it. And that's usually what happens when people are talking in this way.
It's also very weird, if you can go back for 1 second.
I will.
It's very weird that he says, he's talking about how God can communicate to him, how he can communicate to God. And then he's basically asking kind of implicitly, how does this work? And then he says, I do not know, but I am amazed that he does. Like, in what other context, to your point about you just think you have a personal relationship with God, in what other context would we ever accept this explanation for someone telling us about a personal relationship with you? With someone else, I mean. So let's say that you, as my friend, I'm talking to you about my relationship with my wife, and you ask me like, well, hey, can I meet her? Can I get her number? I have to ask her a question. I'm like, well, I'm not exactly sure how we communicate, but I definitely know that we do. I just can't explain to you how. It's very difficult.
You can't give me the number because that's not how you're communicating with her.
Exactly. It's very difficult to like understand how you can legitimately have a relationship that you can't explain in any way.
Yes, and the real reason is because it's important for you to say it. And to try and use as many words as to describe a non-existent relationship as you can to make it sound like it exists. That's all I'm saying. To love pure and chaste from afar, to dream the impossible dream. And then he closes with this stanza from T.S. Eliot, which I've heard before, in which he totally abuses by using it in his position. But here it is. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. It's a beautiful stanza, T.S. Eliot. Okay, here's what I say about it. The problem is that Austin has definitely ended up where he first started, but the place is just the same as when he started. Okay, he's totally misusing this. Now, I have to say, poetry is subject to the reader's interpretation.
But so at the same time, that's the obvious extent of what T.S. Eliot is saying here with the last line, and know the place for the first time. It's about how our perspective can change, even with coming back to our hometown or to a relationship we may have left and come back to. It's about how the change is in us, not in our circumstance or surroundings.
Yes. So you'll probably like number 2. Can you read that?
Austin is trying to frame himself as Sam, Frodo, Merry, or Pippin, fool of a Fife, who returned to the Shire 13 months to the day after leaving, but he is actually just one of the other hobbits who never left.
This is one of the things that really struck me. It was when I read the Lord of the Rings for the first time after my mission.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that the most interesting thing for me at that reading and the whole story was when these guys got back and realizing that slowly and imperceptibly over these huge books, right, that these guys were different from the guys they were when they left. And their experiences had changed them. And they went back to the same place they were originally, but they knew the place for the first time. And unfortunately for them, they knew they didn't belong.
Right. Which is unfortunately often the case, right? When our perspective changes, sometimes we can no longer go back to kind of like those safe little nurseries of our youth.
That's why you can't go home again.
Austin is no hero's journey.
Unless you never grow, then you can go home again.
Right.
I'm sorry, you were going with number 3?
Yeah, I was going to read number 3 for you. Austin is no hero's journey. He never even got out the front door.
Yeah, Austin's is no hero's journey. He never even got out the front door. But there is still time, Austin. Remember, the road goes ever on and on, down from the door where it began. And there it is. This is what a hero's journey is like, Austin, just so you know. The road goes ever on and on, down from the door where it began. Now far ahead the road is gone, and I must follow if I can, pursuing it with eager feet until it joins some larger way where many paths and errands meet. And whither then? I cannot say. That's the hero's journey, or much closer to it than what you've been on. And what you have done, I think, is bathos. Now, bathos is a sudden change, for example, in speech or writing from an important or serious subject to one that is ridiculous. An unexpected descent from the lofty to the ordinary. Bathos means something that begins in a sublime manner and then turns silly or trivial. And it's funny because under this thing that I grabbed off the internet, underneath bathos, it says pronounced delectable. I think that they had not changed that. I think they used that on a previous slide. But this can be done, this bathos, either intentionally or unintentionally. And what I'm talking about, the bathos, is his using this extremely powerful and important passage of poetry, if I can use enough P's, to be a GA speaking in general conference. He's using this in order to describe his silly little stepping his toe out of the tent and then bringing it back in, which is what his journey is about. Oliver Wendell Holmes tried to describe it this way, and this is a famous quote too. And I've heard, is it Jared Halverson? It's one of those apologists who tries to use this in a similar way to Austin using the one by T.S. Eliot, where Oliver Wendell Holmes says, for the simplicity on this side of complexity, I wouldn't give you a fig. So he's going for this idea that we live in simplicity. There's a complexity, whatever the issue is, right? Okay. Whatever it is we're facing in life, and it can be religion, for the simplicity on this side of complexity, I wouldn't give you a fig. That's where we start. But for the simplicity on the other side of complexity, for that, I would give you anything I have. So what Jared Halverson had done, and the mistake he had made, I think, is similar to Austin's, which is thinking about Mormonism, considering other options, but staying Mormon, okay? That is somehow you coming back. Now you're on the other side of complexity, right? Even though you're back where you started from and you're the same person. That's the same kind of thing, I think. And this is something that I put up there to try and hopefully illustrate this. Only those who have truly mastered something can understand this saying, Austin. You might think that you understand it. I'm guaranteeing you that you don't. You might think that you understand what T.S. Eliot wrote. I'm guaranteeing you that you don't. You can only understand this expression, either of them, if you have truly mastered something. Then you can understand what they're saying about the simplicity beyond complexity, about returning to the place where you first began and knowing the place for the first time. What do you think? Because I think most of us, at least when we get to a certain age, have mastered at least one thing. And we realize that the mastery of that, if it's dance, if it's typewriting, it can be so many things. It can be academic as well. But to recognize that through truly mastering something, and now you get to the point where you've mastered typing. Let's just use typing. It's an easy one, okay? You get to the point where you put your fingers on the home keys and you think the words and your fingers do all the rest. You don't have to think about where the keys are anymore. I'm sure the same thing happens to a pianist or other musical instruments. You have to go through all the laborious learning of it and all that complexity. But once you've completely mastered it, now the complexity is gone and now you have a simplicity. But that simplicity is very different than the simplicity you had before you started encountering the complexity by learning and mastering it.
I think what I would say about this is it's very common for people to talk about suffering from imposter syndrome. And I think it is very related to these ideas. And I think sometimes I'll find myself, in my professional life, sometimes even my family life, feeling like, man, I don't know that I'm fully prepared or that I fully have the capability to handle some problem or something that's confronting us. And I think a lot of times it's not until we truly pause and think about the fact that we've come so far, so incrementally, a lot like you used with the example of the hobbits, that we don't even recognize how different we have become as a person. The example I think of is this year I'm going into this is my decade of having my law license. This is my 10th year. And as I've thought about that, there's sometimes I feel like I'm vastly underprepared for certain problems I have to confront. And then I think about all the things I have already done. And I think I wasn't ready to do any of those things either. You just figure it out over time. And I don't mean to always analogize to what we share professionally, because that's not unique to the practice of the law. That's every single thing. That's the simplicity that you're talking about that comes after complexity, is recognizing that, yeah, I might not know exactly how I'm going to get there, but I know that I've developed the skills to come back to what I said earlier about having that assurance that you've developed a sound epistemology. I've developed the skills to know that I know how to figure it out. And if there's nothing else, you can have confidence in that skill and in that approach to life. So I agree with everything you've said here. And again, just I guess for Austin, there is no evidence in your book, in anything you've written, that you have done anything other than dip your toe into the waters of that initial complexity, let alone come out the other side of the simplicity beyond complexity.
It was too hot for his toe and he yanked it back, I think. Okay, there's one other thing I wanted to bring up along these lines. Sorry, I spent the better part of an hour looking for this yesterday, but it has to do with this movie called The Forbidden Kingdom. Any chance you saw that? Jackie Chan? Okay. It's really, I think, a good movie, and it had the scene in it, and I watched it on VHS or whatever it was. But I remember this scene where they're talking, and it's some Eastern philosophy. It's Kung Fu. It's about Kung Fu specifically, and I've taken out some of the extra language. I actually could not find a meme with it on there. I had to go and watch the video, which I finally found, and then copy it down. So this is what it says. And the thing that was interesting, was it 2010? I can't remember. It's been 15 years. I was at a point in my development in Mormonism where listening to these words crystallized my experience, and I found myself in these words, and I understood what it was talking about. And if you can understand what they're talking about, then you probably arrived at this level too. If not, it's going to sound like gobbledygook. So here's what it says from The Forbidden Kingdom. Learn the form, but seek the formless. Learn it all, then forget it all. Learn the way, then find your own way. The true master dwells within. Only you can free him or her, as the case may be. Does that resonate with you? I don't know. Were you ever in martial arts or martial arts movies?
No, I was never really into any of those things. But yeah, I do think about this in the context of what we do, and especially in the work I've done teaching students how to do it too. That's what it feels like to me. You can't. Oh, our field is marked by all these technical skills that you need to learn, but at the very bottom, the core is just teaching people how to think. Really, that's at the very bottom of what it means to be a good attorney. And so when I hear this and I think about the work I've done with students, both as a teacher and as a mentor, that's the way I look at this, is that people do have to learn and find their own way. That's the difficulty that often comes in having those relationships, is you can't just hand it to someone. You can't just teach them all the technical skills and expect them to have that base level. That base level can only be earned through the real struggle, through the hard work.
Well put. So like I say, I think anybody who has mastered anything will understand what this is talking about and have a good insight to it. If you've never mastered anything, then this is going to sound like gobbledygook. It's also going to sound really scary, because it's a lot easier to think the thoughts somebody else gives to you than to think your own thoughts. It's a lot easier to live a life that someone else tells you to live than to live your own life. And that's probably why relatively so few people do it.
And this connects back to when Austin said there is a fate worse than death. To me, this idea that for eternity, I have to have this relationship where I am constantly subjugating myself to the Mormon version of God, Mosiah 3:19, that I need to be willing to submit myself to all things which God seeth fit to inflict upon me. I just don't believe that model, because I don't teach my students or the people I've mentored or my own children that that's the model, that they are never going to outgrow me. I want them to do that when it's age appropriate and experience appropriate. And it is very weird to me to believe that our eternal relationship forever, for all of eternity with God, would be that we never truly become independent adult agents. And yet I think that is the model of God in Mormonism. And that's one of the reasons I think, to me, those things being true actually do represent a fate worse than death. We never get to obtain that state where we are the true master and we unlock that true master within.
The really strange thing is that when you get at least to these last two lines, the true master dwells within, only you can free him. That sounds like something Jesus would have said. That's what he was all about, was trying to get people to realize that the kingdom of God is within you. And it's a very difficult thing. And so his teachings have been used to create institutions to prevent people from finding the true master who dwells within them, which is ironic. Perhaps it's even predictable if we know the way of the world. And it's times like this that it is, I remember that Jesus is not a Western thinker. He's not a Western teacher, and he never was. He is Eastern. He is an Eastern teacher teaching Eastern, if I can call it philosophy or doctrine, whatever word you want to use. But he is Eastern, just like Asia is Eastern. And that's why I think a lot of times his teachings are not so easy to be understood by the Western mind. And usually, therefore, the Western mind, instead of understanding what Jesus was saying, interprets it through a Western lens, so it becomes Western teaching. Those are just some random thoughts.
Yeah.
At the end of this program, oh my gosh, look at this. What is this?
Well, I created this when I didn't realize we were going to do one more episode. So I guess this is a preview of
how happy we're going to be.
Of us being super happy next week. I also thought there was something funny about coming full circle on the yellow brick road, but yeah, I thought I'd mix it up and go with the Rick and Morty animation style this time rather than felt puppet or claymation. But that's how happy we're going to be next week when we're done with this letter.
The thing I like the best is that you're actually giving me the second token of the Aaronic priesthood there. That's what sells it.
Unintentional.
That's what totally sells that thing. Well, that's it. That is it. But it's not it for everything. He's got 2 more chapters, but they're small. We're going to do them both together the next time we get together. I don't even remember what they're called. Do you remember what they're called?
I think one's called Epilogue.
Epilogue. I can actually tell you. I can look this up.
And
because
conclusion. I think it's
It's
conclusion.
so crazy. You're not going to believe it. Okay, so you get to plural marriage, right? Plural marriage. Then he has a chapter titled Other, which is like miscellaneous stuff. So you think he'd be done. Nope. He's got another chapter called Summary of Critical Myths. Maybe done. Nope. Belief in God. Oh, we just covered that one. Not done. He's still got a conclusion and then an epilogue. The only thing he doesn't have is an afterword. But we'll be covering his conclusion and epilogue together the next time that we are together. I don't know when it is. I hope it's soon. And then we are going to let your computer program just chew the heck up out of this thing and tell us how we did compared to how Austin did. Is that true? We're going to do that?
Yeah, we can do that next week.
Okay. Well, we have to conclude it first. We have to finish the letter so that we can't have the people at Psych Ward Radio saying, well, they haven't read the whole letter yet. I mean, you can't listen to them. What do they know what they're saying?
Remember that time they tried to respond to us live and listened for like less than a minute and have never returned to that?
And then they thought, this probably isn't a good idea. We don't need to be streaming what they're saying on our channel because it looks pretty bad.
Just say it, Carden. Say once more onto the breach, my friends. Try it one more time for us.
Yeah.
Humor.
Hopefully you'll do it on this one. And then you can learn a little bit about, I don't know, what was it, the Forbidden Kingdom? Is that what it was?
Mm-hmm.
You learned about the Forbidden Kingdom. I got a feeling that Carden might have watched that. I bet he's a Jackie Chan fan. All right, so that's everything. I'm going to let everybody go. We're going to dismiss class. But before you go, please hit like, please hit subscribe, and please go to radiofreemormon.org if you haven't already. And thank you to all of you good people who have. And click that donate button. Make a donation today if you would. People at Scripture Central should not be getting all the fun and all the donations over there. Okay, that's all I'm saying. We don't have the More Good Foundation taking money from your tithing and then lining our pockets with it. We rely on your donation. So thank you so much. Kolby, thank you so much again. It's a huge sacrifice for you to come on the show. By the way, if you haven't left yet, I'm going to announce it here. It's at the end of the show. I am nominated in what is it? It's the Brody Awards.
Yeah.
For best, I don't know what it's called, epic podcast or year-long podcast for this series. And it only has my name on it, but I think that's only because it goes up on the Radio Free Mormon brand. But I want you to know at this point, and if, God forbid, it should win, I'll be wanting you to join me on the stage, okay? Because I could not have done this series without you, and I probably would not have done this series without you. So any nomination is equally yours as much as mine, and your name should be on there.
Cool. Sounds great. It's been a lot of fun. It's been a lot
We'll
of fun.
find out next Wednesday night on Mormonism Live when we have the big unveiling and we read who wins all the awards. It'll be an exciting night. I hope everybody can join us. And I hope everybody will take the time to watch you, which is already in the past now, as of the time people are hearing us say this, when you went on the Murph show and talked about the witnesses. It sounds like an interesting discussion.
Yeah.
All right. So once again, everybody, thanks so much for watching. Please join us next time for another exciting episode of Radio Free Mormon. Good night.